He had survived 17 assassination attempts, buried 3 rivals with his own hands, and built an empire on the bones of men who thought they were smarter than him. Kang Min-jae didn't fear death. He'd made peace with it the same way a man makes peace with weather. It was coming eventually, and there was no point losing sleep over it. But on a Tuesday morning in October, when a 7-year-old girl grabbed his hand and whispered, "That's not your driver," Kang Min-jae felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt afraid. Like this story? Drop a comment with your city right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loyalty, family, and the people closest to you. The morning started the way all dangerous mornings start. Quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a house the way fog settles over water, slow and suffocating. And by the time you notice, it's already inside your lungs. Kang Min-jae noticed it the way he noticed everything, with his body first, some animal reflex firing beneath conscious thought, tightening the muscles along his jaw, pulling his shoulders back a fraction of an inch. He stood at the second-floor window of his estate and watched the sea below the cliffs go gray and heavy with early morning clouds, and he breathed in through his nose and told himself it was nothing. He had a meeting in 4 hours. He'd been preparing for this meeting for 6 months. Nothing could go wrong today. He told himself that, and he almost believed it. The estate sat on a rocky promontory 3 kilometers outside Busan, the kind of property that required money to find and more money to keep silent. 12 rooms, 2 wings, a garden that cost more per month to maintain than most families spent on rent, and a sea view that Min-jae had stopped seeing years ago because when you live with something long enough, it stops being beautiful and becomes just another piece of your life. The walls were pale stone. The floors inside were dark wood. Everything was clean and ordered and controlled the way Min-jae controlled everything, through systems and structure and the permanent low-grade violence of absolute authority. He dressed without turning on the lights. Charcoal suit, single-breasted, cut close at the shoulders, white shirt. No tie. He'd stopped wearing ties 5 years ago after a man had tried to grab one during an altercation in a parking structure in Seoul, and Min-jae had broken the man's wrist and 3 fingers and decided the sartorial risk wasn't worth it. He fastened his cufflinks, plain brushed silver, the only piece of jewelry he wore, and checked himself in the darkened mirror of the bathroom. 38 years old, 6 feet and a half inch, the face of a man who had made difficult decisions for a long time. Not brutal exactly, but hard in the way that certain kinds of wood are hard. The grain compressed by decades of force into something that doesn't give anymore. There was a scar at the left corner of his mouth, small and pale, from a blade that had caught him when he was 24 and stupid enough to get into a knife fight at close range. He touched it sometimes without thinking, a habit he'd never broken. He touched it now. Today, the leaders of 4 regional syndicates, Osaka, Taipei, Ho Chi Minh City, and Macau, were flying into Busan to meet with him about a joint logistics network. 18 months of back-channel negotiations had brought them to this table. If it went well, the infrastructure he'd spend the next decade building would be untouchable. If it fell apart, rivals would read the failure as weakness, and weakness in this world was the one thing you could not afford to show. Min-jae rolled his neck once, heard it crack, and went downstairs. The kitchen was already active. His household staff, 3 people, all employed through layers of corporate structure that kept their relationship to him legally clean, moved through their morning routines without looking at him directly. That was house protocol, and they'd been trained to it. He poured himself coffee, black, and stood at the kitchen island and reviewed for the last time the meeting notes on his phone. He was still reading when he heard the screen door at the back of the house open and close. Min-jae didn't look up from his phone. He knew who it was by the sound. Not the weight of the footsteps, but the lightness of them. That particular pattern of small feet that never quite remembered to be quiet. "Your shoes are untied." The voice came from the doorway into the kitchen. He looked up. Amara Johnson stood in the kitchen doorway in a yellow windbreaker that was slightly too large for her, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was 7 years old, the daughter of David Johnson, the man who managed the estate's grounds and had for the past 4 years. Amara had what her father called a condition, which, as far as Min-jae could tell, meant she was unusually observant, spoke her mind without a filter, and had absolutely no interest in social niceties. She was small for her age, dark-skinned with large, serious eyes and a habit of tilting her head slightly to one side when she was thinking, like a bird reading the angle of the wind. She was pointing at his shoes. Min-jae looked down. His left shoelace was, in fact, half undone. He bent and retied it. "What are you doing in the main house?" he said. Not sharply. He'd learned early that sharpness bounced off Amara the way water bounced off stone. She simply didn't process social aggression. It had no effect on her. "Daddy sent me to tell you the east garden hose is broken again. He can text me. He's under the fountain." Min-jae straightened up, drank the last of his coffee, set the cup down in the sink. He had 3.5 hours until the cars were due to leave. "Tell him I'll have someone look at it Thursday." He picked up his jacket from the back of the kitchen chair and shrugged into it. "And you shouldn't be in the main house by yourself. Your father's told you that." "I know." She didn't move from the doorway. She was watching him with that unsettling stillness she had sometimes, the particular quality of attention that made adults around her uncomfortable without being able to name exactly why. It was like being looked at very carefully, categorized. "Then go back outside." "Okay." But she still didn't move. She was looking past him now, toward the front windows of the house, the long curved driveway visible through the glass. Min-jae followed her gaze. The morning beyond the windows was gray and still. The driveway was empty. "Amara." "The car's here," she said. He turned back to the window. A black sedan, the correct model, the correct color, had pulled up at the foot of the front steps. He checked his watch. 8:40. His driver Chae Woo-bin was always early. Punctuality was part of why Min-jae kept him. He nodded once and picked up the briefcase from the hall table. He was halfway to the front door when Amara said, "That's not your driver." Min-jae stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood very still in the hallway, briefcase in his hand, jacket settling around his shoulders, and listened to that animal thing in his chest that had tightened again. "What did you say?" "That's not your driver." She was at his elbow now, having crossed the kitchen without sound. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking through the front windows at the car in the driveway. "My driver is a punctual man who drives a black Genesis G90, Min-jae said, keeping his voice level. "That is a black Genesis G90. The plate is wrong." "Amara." "The last two numbers. Your driver's car ends in 47. That one ends in 44. She paused. "Also, he opened the door with his left hand. Your driver always uses his right hand. He held the steering wheel with his right hand, so his left hand was sore after the accident last winter. You gave him 2 weeks off." Min-jae was very quiet. He remembered the accident. Woo-bin had slid on ice on the coast road in February, and he damaged the tendons in his right wrist. He'd spent 6 weeks favoring his left hand. By spring, he'd recovered full use of both, but he still defaulted to his right. Min-jae set the briefcase down slowly on the hall table. He did not move toward the door. He turned, and he looked at Amara Johnson with a new and completely different quality of attention than he had ever turned on her before. "How long have you been watching my driver?" She shrugged. "He's interesting. He knows all the birds. He taught me that the bird that sits on the east garden wall is a brown-eared bulbul. They're territorial." "Amara." He crouched down, put himself at her eye level. Up close, her eyes were very dark and very calm, the eyes of someone who had never learned to perform distress. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to go to the back of the house, through the kitchen, out the service entrance, and find your father. Stay with him. Don't come back to the main house. Can you do that?" She studied his face. "You're scared." "I'm being careful. Those aren't the same thing." "Okay." She turned to go, then stopped, reached into the pocket of her yellow windbreaker, and pulled out a small device. A children's digital recorder, the cheap plastic kind sold at toy stores, colored bright red. She held it out to him. "I recorded something last night," she said. "I was going to give it to my dad, but he was busy. It was the lady with the pretty earrings." Min-jae took the recorder from her hand. "What lady?" "The one that lives here." A pause. "Your wife." She turned and walked back through the kitchen. He heard the screen door open and close. Min-jae stood in his hallway with a child's toy recorder in his hand and looked out through the front windows at the car that was not his car, with the driver that was not his driver. And he stood there for exactly 7 seconds while something cold and final settled into place behind his eyes. Then he walked to the kitchen, poured the rest of the coffee, and pressed play. The recording quality was rough, the microphone on a child's recorder picking up ambient wind and the scrape of leaves, and then 2 voices, close enough to be on the other side of a window or a garden wall. One was Seo Ah's voice. Min-jae knew every register of it, had known it for 11 years, had heard it at dinner tables and in arguments and in the soft middle hours of the night when she thought he was sleeping. He knew it the way a man knows the architecture of a house he has lived in for too long. The second voice he did not recognize at first. Male, younger, speaking in low, controlled sentences with the careful diction of someone very accustomed to not being overheard. He replayed the recording 3 times. By the third play, he was sitting at the kitchen island with his coffee untouched in front of him, and his face had gone very still, and he was breathing slowly and deliberately, the way he breathed when he was dismantling a problem piece by piece, stripping it down to its components, looking for the shape of the thing beneath. On the recording, his wife's voice said, "Tomorrow morning, Chae Woo-bin has been replaced. The route to the airport will take the east road. The terminal at Gamcheon is cleared." The man's voice said, "What about the others in the house?" Seo Ah said, "The house staff arrives after 9. By the time anyone notices, it's finished." Then the man's voice, quieter, almost gentle. "This is the last thing I'll ever ask of you, Seo Ah." And his wife said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "I know." Min-jae set the recorder down on the kitchen counter. He looked at the sea through the kitchen window. The clouds had dropped lower and the water was the color of old pewter, and a fishing boat was moving across the far edge of his sight line, too far to see clearly. He watched it until it disappeared. Then he picked up his personal phone, the one not logged to any network his staff had access to, and dialed Choi Seong-ho. Seong-ho answered on the second ring. 61 years old, the man had been at Min-jae's side since Min-jae was 23 and still learning which fights to walk into. He was the kind of man who wore the same 3 suits in rotation and didn't own a computer and had survived 4 regime changes within the organization because he was, at the cellular level, loyal. Not to power, not to money, to Min-jae. "Don't come to the front of the house," Min-jae said. "There's a car in the driveway. I need it identified and I need the plates tracked before the driver makes contact with anyone. Can you do that in the next 10 minutes? A pause. Then, without preamble, "Is it today?" "I think so." "Understood." Another pause. "Are you safe right now?" "I'm standing in my kitchen. Stay there." Seong-ho ended the call. Min-jae stood in his kitchen and listened to his house. He could hear, from the upper wing, the faint sound of running water. Seo Ah's shower. She was awake. She was going through the motions of a normal morning in a house where she believed her husband was about to walk out the front door and into a car that would take him somewhere he would not come back from. He tried to feel something about that. He pushed at it the way you push at a bruise, testing the edges of the pain. He found anger. That was familiar ground. He found, beneath the anger, something older and uglier. The particular grief of a man who had trusted precisely one person in his adult life with anything close to softness, and was holding the proof that she had planned to put him in the ground. He did not let himself stay in that grief. He filed it away. There would be time for it later, or there wouldn't, but either way, it was not useful to him right now. What was useful? The car in the driveway, the man's voice on the recording, the name Gamcheon, the abandoned terminal south of the port, a container yard that had been decommissioned 3 years ago and sat behind chain link and rust, the kind of place that was useful for exactly one thing. Seong-ho called back in 8 minutes. "The vehicle is registered to a logistics company in Incheon. The company has been dormant for 2 years. The driver is unknown. The plates were altered. Someone switched the last 2 digits. Who noticed?" A pause. "What?" "Who noticed the plates?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll explain later. What about the company in Incheon? Who's behind it?" He heard Seong-ho typing, the old man hunting and pecking at a keyboard the way he'd always done, refusing to let anyone do his searching for him. Then, "I need an hour." "You have 40 minutes. I'm supposed to be in that car in 40 minutes. He picked up the recorder again, turned it over in his hand. "There's also a name I need you to run. The voice on a recording I have. I'll play it for you. He held the recorder to the phone and played the first 10 seconds of the male voice. The quality through two phones was even rougher, but the voice was distinctive. That controlled cadence, the slight flattening of certain vowels that placed the speaker somewhere between Seoul and the southern coast. Seong-ho listened, and then Seong-ho was quiet for a very long time. Seong-ho, play it again. Min-jae played it again. Another long silence. When Seong-ho spoke, his voice had gone flat in a specific way that Min-jae recognized. The flatness of a man controlling something very large that had just moved through him. Where did you get that recording? David Johnson's daughter. She was playing in the East Garden. How old is she? 7. Silence again. Then, a 7-year-old girl. Seong-ho, the name. I don't know for certain. The old man exhaled. But that voice, the way he speaks. Min-jae? There was a man, Baek Chun-sik, 20 years ago. I know who Baek Chun-sik was. He had a son, Noah. The boy was 16 when Baek Chun-sik died. We assumed, another exhale. We assumed he'd left the country, disappeared. There was no trace. Min-jae looked at the recorder in his hand. There's a trace now. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and ran through the arithmetic of the situation the way he ran through all problems. Not from the emotion outward, but from the mechanics inward. Noah Baek, 20 years old when Min-jae had last thought about him. 36 now, if he was alive. And if that was his voice on Amar's recorder, he was very much alive and had been patient for a very long time. Patient enough to reach Seo-ah. Min-jae thought about that. He thought about the slow work of it. Months, probably years, of cultivating access to someone inside his household, inside his life. The kind of patience that is indistinguishable from obsession. He thought about Seo-ah and the word she'd used at the end of the recording. I know, not reluctant, not afraid, just settled. Like a woman who had made her decision in some other season and was no longer interested in revisiting it. He thought about June. He stopped thinking about June because that line of thought led somewhere he was not ready to go yet, and he needed to be steady right now. He needed to be a man who could keep his face calm and his hands still while the world he'd constructed with 20 years of violence and will came apart at the seams. He put the recorder in his inside jacket pocket. He walked to the front hall, opened the door, and descended the stone steps toward the car. The driver got out when he heard the door open. He was the right height, the right build, wearing the correct uniform, dark jacket, white shirt. Someone had done their research. From a distance, in low morning light, he would read correctly. But he opened the door with his left hand, and he didn't know about the scar on Woo Bin's right wrist. And he didn't know that a 7-year-old girl with perfect recall had cataloged every habitual motion of the man who drove this car. Min-jae stopped at the bottom of the steps. Where's Woo Bin? He said. The man's face went very slightly, very professionally wrong. Just a flicker. He called in sick this morning, sir. I was sent as a replacement. By who? Dispatch. Which dispatch service? The man opened his mouth and Min-jae watched him decide in real time which lie to reach for. And in that half second of visible calculation, Min-jae knew everything he needed to know. It's all right, Min-jae said. He descended the last 2 steps. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the man with an expression that showed nothing, that was smooth and controlled and gave away not even the shadow of what was happening behind his eyes. I'll ride in the front today. I need to make calls. The driver was thrown. That wasn't in the script. He recovered quickly because he'd been trained well, but he recovered a half beat too slow. Of course, sir. Min-jae got into the passenger seat. As they pulled out of the estate gates, he sent a single text to Seong-ho from his private phone, the address of the Gamcheon terminal, and 2 words, counter protocol. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket beside Amar's recorder, and he looked out the passenger window at the gray sea below the coast road, and he let his mind go cold and clean and focused, the way it went in the moments before everything became irreversible. The car drove south, away from the airport. Min-jae noted this without expression. He had 6 kilometers before they reached the terminal. He spent 3 of them studying the driver's hands on the wheel. Left dominant, as Amara had said, But he switched to his right when he thought Min-jae was looking away. Careful. Trained. Not a street-level operative. The man had been put together for this specifically, which meant resources, which meant organization, which meant Noah Baek was not working alone, had not been working alone for some time. He spent the 4th kilometer thinking about Woo Bin and where Woo Bin might be right now, and he felt the first real spike of something that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but was more personal than either. Woo Bin had worked for him for 9 years. He knew the man's family, knew his son had started secondary school last spring, knew his wife made a particular kind of kimchi that she sometimes left in a cooler at the estate gate, with a note in a handwriting that never got any less formal, no matter how many years passed. Woo Bin had never been anything but exactly what he appeared to be, and if someone had gotten to him, don't, Min-jae told himself. One thing at a time. He spent the 5th kilometer thinking about the meeting in 3 hours that he would now miss, and what that would mean, and what cover story Seong-ho would construct, and whether any of the arriving syndicate heads would read the missed meeting as an invitation. He spent the 6th kilometer thinking about June. They reached the terminal. The Gamcheon container yard sat at the end of a broken road behind the main port district, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, the wire gone orange with salt and age. The containers were stacked in rusted rows, 30 feet high in places. The corridor between them narrow enough that the car had to slow to a crawl. The gate had been cut open, the padlock missing. The driver pulled in through the gate and stopped. "We're here," he said. Min-jae didn't move. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and watched the terminal through the windshield and counted what he could see. 2 men visible near a shipping container 40 meters away. Almost certainly more he couldn't see, positioned in the corridors between the stacks. "The airport," Min-jae said conversationally, "is in the other direction." The driver reached inside his jacket. Min-jae caught the man's wrist before the gun cleared the holster. What followed was brief and not clean. Min-jae was not a man who fought elegantly. He was a man who had learned to fight in situations where elegance was a liability, and he fought now with the particular efficiency of someone who understands that every second spent in physical contact with an opponent is a second during which something can go wrong. He broke the driver's wrist and took the gun, and was out of the car and moving before the man finished screaming. The 2 visible operatives were already moving. Min-jae shot out the right front tire of the sedan. Not the operatives. Not yet. Because the noise of the shots would carry, and he needed 30 more seconds. And then he put his back against the nearest container and took stock. He had 1 handgun with 12 rounds. Seong-ho's team was, he checked his watch, 6 minutes out if they'd broken every speed limit on the coast road. Probably 5 minutes if Seong-ho was driving, which he would be. He had 5 minutes. He had 5 minutes in an abandoned container terminal with an unknown number of hostile operatives, his own handgun, and the absolute knowledge that this was not, in fact, the plan. The plan that Noah Baek and Seoa had constructed with such careful patience, called for him to arrive and be walked at gunpoint to some specific location and executed cleanly, with witnesses who could confirm it to whatever parties needed confirming. He had deviated from the plan. He pulled out his phone, sent Seong-ho a second text. "I'm inside East End near gate," and then he put the phone away and focused. The next 4 minutes were neither elegant nor clean, and afterward Min-jae would not remember them in sequence but in fragments. A burst of noise from behind a container and the way he'd already been moving away from it. A face he'd glimpsed for a second before he'd stopped looking at faces and started looking at hands. The specific cold of the salt air on the back of his neck. His own breathing, which he'd managed to keep controlled with some application of will. When Seong-ho's vehicles came through the gate, 4 cars, 12 men, there were 3 operatives down and Min-jae was standing in the corridor between 2 rusted container stacks with his jacket torn at the shoulder and a shallow cut along his left forearm that had bled more than it should have given its depth, soaking his cuff. Seong-ho got out of the lead vehicle. He was 61 years old and moved like a man who had seen things like this before and expected to see more. He walked to Min-jae and stood and looked at him for a moment. "The rest of them ran," Min-jae said, "when you came through the gate. We'll find them. The driver is in the car. He'll need medical attention before he talks." Min-jae looked at his cut forearm without much interest. "I need you to find Woo Bin, alive." "We're already looking." "Good." He straightened his jacket with his free hand. The torn shoulder was going to require a new jacket. He made note of it with the dissociated practicality of shock beginning to settle. I need everything you have on Noah Beck in 2 hours. Where he's been, what he's built, who he's using, all of it. Min Jae? The old man's voice had something in it that made Min Jae stop and look at him directly. Seong Ho was not a man who used names without reason. He was, in particular, not a man who used Min Jae's given name in the field. He used his title, or he used nothing. What? Min Jae said. Seong Ho looked at him for another moment, then, we found 2 of our guards this morning, inside the east perimeter. They'd been replaced. The men we found aren't ours. They've been wearing the uniforms for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Someone had been inside his security perimeter for 2 weeks. And our men, Min Jae said, transferred to private security firms in Daegu and Gwangju, with your signature according to the paperwork. Min Jae felt the shape of the thing then, properly, for the first time. Not just the assassination attempt, which was manageable, which was the kind of problem he had handled before, but the depth of the preparation behind it. This was not a plan built in months. This was a plan built in years. Someone had spent years in proximity to his life, learning its texture, its rhythms, the signatures on his paperwork, the habits of his driver. The meeting, Min Jae said. I've made contact. I've said you're ill. They've been patient. They won't be patient for long. I know. We have a few days. Min Jae nodded. He looked around at the container yard, the rust, the salt, the broken road, the morning light coming flat and gray between the stacked steel. Take the car. Leave me 1 vehicle and 2 people. I'll stay. No. I need you working. I need the information on Bayek. I need the corrupted guards identified and replaced quietly. He paused. Quietly, Seong Ho. I don't want anyone to know what happened this morning. Not the staff. Not... He stopped. Seong Ho waited. Not anyone in the house. The old man held his gaze. Min Jae? I know what you're going to say. She was part of it. I know. You need to... I know what I need to do. Min Jae's voice had gone very flat and very clean, the way it went when he was past the point of discussing something. Right now I need information, and I need time, and I need my wife to believe I'm dead or missing long enough that she makes contact with Bayek, because when she does, I'm going to have a location. Seong Ho looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, And June? And there it was. The thing Min Jae had stopped himself thinking about in the car. The name he'd been carrying around the edges of all morning, not looking at directly. Park June, 22 years old. The boy Min Jae had pulled from a burning building when he was 4 years old and raised as his own, not legally, because the legal machinery of adoption was not a world Min Jae had ever trusted himself to navigate, but in every way that mattered. June had grown up in this house. June had been educated in schools Min Jae had paid for and disciplined by men Min Jae had chosen and given every advantage that Min Jae's considerable resources could provide. June also had, in the last 8 months, become increasingly distant in ways that Min Jae had attributed to youth and independence and the normal friction of a 22-year-old testing the edges of a controlled life. He looked at Seong Ho. What about June? He said, and his voice was controlled and level and completely neutral. Seong Ho held his gaze. Where was he this morning? Min Jae said nothing. He left the estate at 6 a.m., Seong Ho said carefully. I only noticed because I was already watching the cameras. He took his own car. He's not answering his phone. The container yard was very quiet except for the wind off the sea. Pull his movements, Min Jae said. Phone, card transactions, cameras. Pull it all and don't tell me anything until you have something complete. Min Jae. Complete, Seong Ho, not suspicion. Complete. He turned and walked toward the remaining vehicle, stopped with his hand on the door. The cut on his forearm had slowed but not stopped. And find me a way to get back into the estate through the service road without being seen. He got in the car and drove back toward the coast road alone, and he did not let himself think about June until he was back inside his own gates. And by the time he was back inside his own gates, he had almost managed to build the wall he needed between what he suspected and what he was willing to consider. Almost. In the East Garden, Amara Johnson was sitting cross-legged on a stone bench beside her father's broken fountain, reading a book with the same absolute focused calm with which she seemed to do everything. She looked up when Min-jae passed on the path 30 feet away. She studied the torn jacket, the stained cuff, his face. She said nothing. He stopped walking, looked at her. "You did well this morning," he said. "What you told me. It was important." She considered this with her head tilted. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. You have blood on your arm." "I know. My dad has bandages in the tool shed." Min-jae looked at her for a moment. At this 7-year-old girl with the serious eyes and the yellow windbreaker and the recorder she'd thought to bring because she'd thought to notice, in the first place, that something was wrong. Something that everyone else in his household, the trained men, the vetted staff, the network of surveillance and security he'd spent 20 years building, had missed entirely. He crossed the 30 feet of garden path and sat down on the stone bench beside her. Just for a moment. He was going to have the worst week of his adult life, and there was work to do, and somewhere in the city his wife was waiting to hear that he was dead, and somewhere Seong-ho was pulling threads that were going to lead somewhere Min-jae did not want to go. But for one moment he sat on a garden bench in the gray morning light and looked at the broken fountain and didn't do anything. "What are you reading?" he said. She tilted the book so he could see the cover. It was a children's field guide to Korean birds. "Your driver taught you about the bulbul," he said. "Yes, they mate for life." She turned a page. "The female is the one that picks the territory. The male just defends wherever she chooses." Min-jae looked at the fountain. Water was still dripping from the broken hose connection, slow and irregular, each drop hitting the stone basin with a small, precise sound. "Go find your father," he said. "Tell him I'm going to need the tool shed key." She closed the book and slid off the bench without argument and walked away through the garden, unhurried, the way she did everything. Min-jae sat alone for another 30 seconds, listening to the broken fountain. Then he got up and went inside to start the work of finding out how deep the knife had gone and exactly whose hands were on it. Tuts. The answer, when Seong-ho called back 4 hours later with a voice stripped of everything except the bare fact of the information, was that it had gone deeper than Min-jae had prepared himself for. The voice on Amara's recording was confirmed. Noah Bayek, alive, using 3 different identities across 2 countries. The bribed guards, 7 men, over a span of 14 months. The financial transfers from Seoa's private account. 18 months of transactions, small enough individually to fall below automated alerts, large enough in aggregate to fund a small operation. And Park Jun's phone was, placed by cell tower data, had been at the Gamcheon terminal. Not this morning, 3 weeks ago. And again, last Tuesday. Min-jae sat with that information alone in his study, the door closed, the sea going dark outside the window as the afternoon died, and he sat with it for a long time before he picked up the phone. He did not call Seong-ho. He called Jun's number. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail, and Min-jae listened to his son's voice on the recorded message. The same flat, slightly sardonic delivery Jun had had since he was 16 and decided that being unreadable was a form of armor. And then the beep came and Min-jae said carefully and quietly, "I'm not angry. Come home." He hung up. He sat in the study until the room was dark, and then he sat some more. And outside the window the sea made the sound it always made, indifferent and constant, and somewhere in the house above him his wife moved through her evening routines believing he was dead. And somewhere in the city his son was not answering his phone. And Kang Min-jae, who had survived 17 assassination attempts and buried 3 rivals and built an empire from nothing, sat in the dark and waited to find out whether he still had a family or whether he'd been living alone in this house for longer than he'd realized. Jun didn't come home that night. Min-jae sat in his study until the clock on the wall read 11:40 and the house had gone completely still around him, the staff long dismissed, the kitchen dark, the hallways quiet except for the sound of the sea coming through the window. He'd left cracked an inch. He sat in his chair with the phone on the desk in front of him and the recorder beside it, and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. And he watched the phone the way a man watches a door. He's not sure he wants to open. At 11:53 it rang. Not Jun, Seong-ho. "We found Woo Bin," the old man said. No preamble. "He's alive. They had him in a storage unit in Saha district. They told him his wife was being watched, that if he said anything, if he didn't cooperate with the switch, they'd..." A pause. He believed them. He cooperated. He's been in that storage unit for 18 hours. Min-jae closed his eyes for 1 second. Get him to a doctor. Private. Not a hospital. Already done. His wife. Safe. She didn't know anything. Make sure she's compensated. Make sure Woo Bin understands he's not in trouble. A silence on the line that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Then, Min-jae, he gave them access to the vehicle schedule. He gave them the alternate route protocols. He had no choice, but he had no choice, Min-jae said. I heard you the first time. Another silence. There's something else. Say it. The transfers from Seo Ah's account. We traced the endpoint. It's a company called Beck Holdings, registered in Macau, 18 months ago. The old man's voice was precise and deliberate, the way it got when he was delivering information he knew was going to land badly. But the initial capital for Beck Holdings, the seed money, the amount that made the company viable enough to open accounts and establish credit, that money came from somewhere inside our own network. Min-jae opened his eyes. He looked at the whiskey glass. How much? 2 million. Transferred 11 months ago through 3 intermediary accounts. All 3 accounts trace back to a shell company that was established using access codes that only 3 people in our organization have. The room was very quiet. You, Min-jae said. Not me. No. Min-jae hadn't actually thought so. Me. Your codes, yes. Someone used your authentication. Or someone who had access to my authentication. He picked up the whiskey glass and set it back down without drinking. Someone who's been in this house long enough to, He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Xiang-ho didn't push him to. I want the transfer records, Min-jae said. Timestamps, origin points, the intermediaries, everything. I'll have it to you by morning. One more thing. He stood up from the desk and walked to the window, looked out at the dark sea. June's movements. The cell tower data you pulled. Last 3 months. Not just the terminal visits. Everything. Min-jae, everything, Xiang-ho. A long pause. It won't be easy to look at. I know that. The old man exhaled. I'll send it. Min-jae stood at the window after he hung up and looked at the sea for a while. The tide was coming in. He could hear it against the rocks below the cliff, that regular percussion, patient and indifferent, water doing what water does regardless of what's happening on land. He'd always found some use in that sound. In some part of himself he'd never put language to. It was the only honest sound he knew. No intention behind it, no design, just force and time and the slow geography of things. He went to bed at 1 in the morning and didn't sleep until nearly 4, and the sleep he got was thin and unhelpful. And when he woke at 6, he already knew, by the texture of the exhaustion, that it was going to be a day that required him to be something he was running low on. Controlled. Seo Ah was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She was standing at the counter making tea, her back to the doorway, dressed in a silk robe the color of smoke. She moved with the particular unhurried quality she always had in the mornings. Seo Ah had never been a person who rushed, who performed urgency. It was one of the first things he'd noticed about her, 11 years ago, at a dinner he'd attended as a formality. The way she occupied space without apology, without performance. He'd found it compelling then. He found it different now. She turned when she heard him. And her face did something. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough that if he hadn't been watching for it, he would have missed it entirely. A flicker of something that resolved almost instantly into the expression she intended to have, which was warmth, mild surprise, the ordinary morning face of a wife who sees her husband. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Do you want coffee?" "I'll get it." He moved to the coffee maker and she stepped aside, and he was aware, with an acuity that felt almost physical, of the exact distance between them. 60 centimeters. He could reach out and close that distance in less than a second. She was aware of it too. He could tell by the way she didn't quite relax, the way her shoulders held a fraction of tension that her face wasn't showing. "How did the meeting go yesterday?" she said. She was looking at her tea, adjusting the cup on the counter. "Rescheduled," he said. "One of the parties had a travel issue. That's frustrating after all the preparation." "It is." He poured coffee. He drank it standing at the counter 3 feet away from her, and the kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of morning, the refrigerator cycling, a bird calling outside, the faint movement of wind around the eaves of the house. Normal sounds, the sounds of a house where nothing was wrong. June called me last night, Seoa said. Min-jae's hand did not tighten on the coffee cup. He was deliberate about that. Oh? He said he's staying with a friend in the city for a few days, some university thing. She picked up her tea. He sounded fine. Good. You're not worried? Should I be? She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and gave him nothing, and he looked back and gave her the same. Two people standing in a kitchen, each holding a hot drink, performing a marriage. You seem tired, she said. I told you. Couldn't sleep. She nodded. She picked up her tea and walked toward the hallway, paused in the doorway. I'm having lunch with the Hana Foundation people today. Fundraiser planning. I'll be back by 4. Fine. She left. Minji stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of her footsteps going up the stairs. And then he listened to the silence after. And then he set down his coffee cup very carefully on the counter and stood with both hands flat on the stone surface and breathed through his nose until the thing in his chest settled back down to something manageable. She was going to make contact. The lunch was cover. Today? Today. The day after the morning Min-jae hadn't died the way he was supposed to. She was going to find a way to reach Noah back and tell him something had gone wrong. He pulled out his phone and texted Seong-ho a single word. Today. The reply came in 40 seconds. Team is ready. He picked up his coffee and went to the study and spent the next hour reading Seong-ho's transfer records, and they were exactly as difficult as the old man had warned him, and by the end of the hour he had a headache behind his eyes that he knew was not going to get better anytime soon. The authentication codes. The access. The shell company. He kept coming back to the timestamps. The first transfer had been made 11 months ago on a Thursday afternoon, between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m. He sat with the timestamp and thought about every Thursday afternoon in the past year, about where he'd been, about where June had been, about what the routine of his house looked like on a Thursday afternoon, and he was still sitting with it when his phone rang and it was a number he didn't have saved, which meant it was a number he wasn't supposed to have but did anyway, routed through a layer of people who maintained certain kinds of accessibility for him. He answered. You didn't die, said the voice on the other end. Min-jae leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. Is that a question? No. Noah Beck's voice, stripped of the caution it had carried on Amara's recording, was different, younger sounding, and beneath the youth, something hard and unfinished. The voice of a man who had been building toward one thing for so long that he'd forgotten there might be anything else. It's an observation. You're calling me on a phone I shouldn't know you have, Min-jae said. That's either confidence or desperation. Neither. I want you to know that this isn't finished. I assumed. I want you to know why. I know why. A pause. You think you know, you don't. Min-jae kept his voice level and unimpressed, which cost him something because the voice on the phone was the voice from the recorder, was the voice of the man who had spent years getting inside his house and inside his marriage. And the costing of it was something he felt in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the specific quality of effort it took to not allow any of that into his voice. Then tell me. My father was not what you made him. Your father was many things. He was not a traitor. He was. No heat in it, just the flat fact of it. I have documentation you'll never see because it implicates people who were useful to keep alive. I have names he sold. I have the families of those names, or what was left of them after what your father's information caused. He was not an innocent man, Noah. The silence on the line was the specific quality of silence that follows something a person has heard before, that they've been told before, and have made their decision about in advance. He was my father, Noah said. I know. You took everything. Yes. Another silence. Longer. When Noah spoke again, something had shifted in his voice, some calculation completing. This isn't finished, Kang. I know that too. Min-jae lowered his eyes from the ceiling, looked at the transfer records on his desk. I'll find you, you know that. Maybe. A pause. Or maybe I'll find your son first. The line went dead. Min-jae sat with the phone in his hand for 3 seconds. Then he put it down very carefully on the desk, the way a man puts something down when the alternative is throwing it, and he breathed and he thought. Your son. Not your wife, not your organization, not you. Your son. He picked the phone back up and called Seong-ho. Pull everything you have on June, he said. I want it in an hour. I don't care if it's incomplete. The old man arrived at the estate 50 minutes later with a folder and a face that had the closed, careful look he got when the news was bad enough that he was pre-managing how to deliver it. He sat across the desk from Min-jae in the study and put the folder down and folded his hands on top of it and looked at Min-jae with something that was not quite pity and not quite regret, but lived somewhere between the two. Just put it on the desk, Min-jae said. Seong-ho slid the folder across. Min-jae opened it. The cell tower data first. June's phone placing him not just at the Gamcheon terminal, but at 6 other locations over the past 4 months. A cafe in Seongdong-gu, where one of Noah Beck's confirmed shell company representatives had been seen twice. A hotel in Haeundae that Seong-ho had annotated with the notation registered to Baek Holdings subsidiary. A parking structure in Nampo 3 days ago for 47 minutes at 11 p.m. Then the other documents. Financial. A bank account in June's name not one Min-jae knew about, with deposits over the past 6 months totaling slightly over 300,000 won. Small amounts, irregular intervals, the kind of deposits that are designed to look like nothing. Then a photograph. Min-jae looked at the photograph for a long time. It had been taken with a telephoto lens at distance, and the quality was the rough quality of surveillance photography, but the subjects were clear enough. A cafe table. June, in a gray jacket Min-jae had seen before, sitting across from a man whose face was partially obscured by the angle. But the jawline was clear. The posture was clear. Noah Baek, 3 weeks ago. How long have you had this? Min-jae said. Seong-ho was very still. 4 days. Min-jae looked up from the photograph. He looked at the old man. Seong-ho met his gaze without flinching, which was the only honest answer available. You waited 4 days, Min-jae said. I was verifying. I didn't want to bring you something incomplete. You were protecting him. Seong-ho didn't answer, which was also an answer. Min-jae closed the folder. He put his hands flat on it and sat with the specific weight of the moment, the weight of knowing something you'd been trying not to know, the weight of it finally arriving, solid and real. He's been meeting with Noah Baek for 3 weeks, at minimum. At minimum. And the authentication codes, the transfers. He looked at the folder. June has my codes. He has access to the secondary authentication system. You gave him access 2 years ago when you started having him manage the northern properties. Yes. Min-jae remembered that. He remembered the afternoon he'd sat down with June and walked him through the system. And June had asked careful questions and taken notes, and afterward they'd had dinner and June had been not warm exactly. June was never exactly warm, but present, attentive, which with June was the equivalent of warmth. He'd thought that evening that things were going to be okay, that the distance of the preceding months had been nothing more than what he'd told himself it was, a young man finding his edges. He didn't know what he was doing, Seong-ho said, or he didn't know the full scope of it. Don't. Min-jae Topum, don't explain him to me. His voice was very flat, very final. I'll explain him to himself when I find him. They sat in the study with the folder between them and the sea outside the window going silver in the afternoon light. And after a while, Seong-ho said quietly, What do you want me to do? Keep the surveillance on Seoa. When she makes contact with Baek, and she will, today, I'm certain of it, I want to know where he is within the hour. And June? Find him. Don't approach him. Don't speak to him. Find him and watch him and call me. And then? And then I'll go. He stood up. The headache was still there behind his eyes. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple for a moment, then dropped his hand. Alone. Seong-ho stood as well. He was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic of whether to say the next thing. He said it. That's not safe. No. Baek will be watching him. If you approach June, Baek will know you're alive and operational and that you've found the connection. He won't wait. He'll move the timeline. I know. Min-jae picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, which means I need to move faster than he expects. Or you could let me handle it. No. Min-jae, let me take people to June and bring him. You're not going to bring my son to me at gunpoint, Min-jae said. The sentence came out with more force than he'd intended, and he let it sit there, unapologetic. That's not how this conversation is going to happen. Seong-ho looked at him for a long moment. And if June doesn't want to come? Min-jae picked up his phone, put it in his jacket. Then I'll have my answer. He went downstairs and into the East Garden, because the East Garden was habit at this point, and because the air outside was better than the air inside the study, which had started to feel close and pressurized in the way rooms feel when they contain too much of something unspoken. Amara was in the garden again. She'd apparently decided that the East Garden was an acceptable territory for herself, and Min-jae had stopped being surprised to find her there. She was crouched by the garden wall, examining something in the base of a shrub, and she looked up when she heard him. "There's a nest," she said. "Brown-eared bulbul, 2 eggs." He walked over and looked down. The nest was well hidden in the lower branches, woven tight, 2 pale eggs visible in the cup of it. "Don't touch it," he said. "I know." She looked up at him, the serious dark eyes doing their categorizing thing. "You look worse than yesterday." "Thank you, Amara." "Are you sick?" "No." "My dad looks like that when he's worried about money." Min-jae crouched down beside her and looked at the nest. Up close, the eggs were marked with small reddish spots, irregular, like something coded. "When your father looks like that," he said, "what do you do?" She thought about it. "I make him tea. He doesn't drink it, but it helps him to have something to do with his hands." Min-jae looked at her. She looked back at him with the same expression she always had, which contained no performance and no agenda, and was therefore the most honest face he saw on a regular basis. "You're very strange," he said. "My dad says that too." His phone buzzed. He stood and looked at the screen. Seong-ho. She made contact. Cafe in Gwangali. Meeting confirmed for 6 p.m. He read the message twice. 6 p.m., 4 hours. "Go inside, Amara," he said. She looked at the phone, then at his face. Then she stood and tucked her field guide under her arm and walked toward the house without arguing. At the door, she stopped and looked back. "Don't forget to eat something," she said. Then she went inside. Min-jae stood in the garden with the phone in his hand and 4 hours on the clock and thought about June, sitting across a cafe table from Noah Beck, listening to a version of history carefully assembled from selected truths and shaped absences, a version in which Kang Min-jae was the monster and Baek Chun-sik was the martyr, and thought about how 22 years old is the precise age at which a person most desperately needs a story that explains their pain, and how that need is the most dangerous vulnerability a man can carry. He thought about a 4-year-old boy in a burning building. He thought about carrying him out. He thought about Noah Beck, who had been patient for 20 years and was not finished. He sent Seong-ho a text, "Find June before 6. I'll be there." The reply was immediate. "Working on it." Min-jae pocketed the phone. The afternoon light was low and golden, and the garden smelled like salt and turned earth, and somewhere in the branches above the nest, the bulbul was calling, small and territorial and entirely committed to the defense of its small particular corner of the world. He went back inside to wait. And at 4:17 p.m., 43 minutes before Seong-ho had expected to have a location, June Park walked through the front door of the estate and stood in the hallway, and he and Min-jae looked at each other across 12 feet of dark wood floor, and neither of them said anything for a long time. June looked like he hadn't slept. He was in the same gray jacket from the surveillance photograph, and there was a tension in him that went all the way to the surface, pulling at the skin around his jaw, making his eyes older than 22. He was holding his car keys. His knuckles, Min-jae noticed, were white. "You knew I'd come back," June said. His voice was flat and stripped of the sardonic quality it usually carried. What was left was younger and rawer and worse. "I hoped," Min-jae said. "That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." June looked at him for another moment, his jaw working, and then he said, "Tell me about my father." Min-jae held his gaze. "Sit down. Tell me about my father." "June, he told me you killed him." The words came out with a velocity that had clearly been building for some time, compressed by weeks or months of holding them in, and now they were out, they filled the hallway with a specific kind of pressure. He told me you killed him and took everything. He told me you found me and you raised me because you felt guilty and because you wanted someone inside your house that you could control. Someone who'd never question you because they owed you their life. The hallway was very quiet. He told me about the night my father died, June said. He had documents, photographs. He had... His voice cracked on the last word, just a fracture, just for a second, before he drove it back down. He had things that looked real, Minjai. I know, Minjai said. He's had 20 years to make them look real. Then tell me they're not. The white-knuckled keys, the jaw. Tell me my father wasn't the man he said he was. Tell me why you killed him. Tell me the truth, all of it, and I'll listen. But if you can't do that, he stopped. If I can't do that, what? June looked at him, and the look had something in it that Minjai recognized with the specific recognition of a man who has looked in mirrors for a long time. The look of someone who has already made a decision but is waiting to find out if there's a reason to unmake it. Then I'm done, June said. With all of this. Minjai looked back at him. He breathed. He thought about 4 hours on the clock and Seoa in a cafe in Guangali and Noah Baek tightening his timeline, and he thought about the long answer and the short answer and the fact that June was standing in this hallway at all, which meant something, which meant the decision wasn't as finished as his voice was trying to make it sound. Sit down, Minjai said again. Quiet, no command in it. Please. Something in June shifted, small, almost imperceptible, but Minjai had been reading him for 18 years. He sat. And Minjai sat across from him and looked at his son's face, the face of a 22-year-old who had been systematically fed poison and had swallowed some of it and was here, still, asking for the antidote. And he began to talk. He talked for 40 minutes. He told June about Baek Chun-sik, not the version Noah had given him, the martyred patriarch, but the actual man, the man who had sold out his own operatives for protection money, who had given names to a competing network that had resulted in the deaths of 11 people, including 4 men with families. He told June what the fallout had looked like. He told June about the burning building and what had caused the fire and who had been responsible and why. He told June about carrying him out. He told June about the first week, when the boy had not spoken and had not eaten properly and had slept in short, terrified intervals, and about the specific, unfamiliar feeling of sitting outside a door listening to a 4-year-old try not to cry and not knowing what to do with that and doing it anyway. June sat through all of it with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he didn't speak, and his face did things that Minjai watched carefully and without interrupting. When Minjai finished, the hallway was quiet for a long time. Then June said, very quietly, he had photographs of my father with people from your organization, smiling, like they were friends. They were colleagues, before. He had... June stopped, started again. He made it look like my father was trying to leave, like he'd found a way out, and you stopped him. I know what he made it look like. It looked real, Minjai. His voice had gone thin. It looked so... He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, lowered it. I wanted it to be real. I wanted there to be a reason. He stopped again. A reason for what? June looked up at him. His eyes were red at the edges, for feeling like I never fit here. Like there was something missing that you couldn't give me, and I didn't know what it was, and I kept thinking if I found out who my real father was, then I'd... He stopped. The hallway held the weight of it. Then you'd know what was missing, Minjai said. June looked at him. There's nothing missing, Minjai said. There never was. You felt that way because you were young, and you lost something early, and that loss doesn't go away. So it changes shape, but it doesn't go away. He didn't give you a father, June. He gave you a wound and called it a story. June was very still. He's been using you, Minjai said. Not because he cares about your father or your pain or your history, because you were the only person with access to this house that he could reach. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. And then June said, in a voice Minjai had to lean forward to hear, the authentication codes. Yes. He told me he said it was accessing records, old records about my father's death. He said you'd buried them in the financial system and the only way to... He stopped. His jaw tightened so hard Min-jae could see the muscle working. He used me to move money. Yes. I didn't know. The words came out cracked at the center. Min-jae, I know you didn't. I'm not. He stopped. His hands were shaking. I'm not that person. I'm not someone who would. I know who you are. Min-jae said it without raising his voice, without emphasis, the way you say something you mean. I've known who you are for 18 years. Jun put his face in his hands. Min-jae sat with him. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Let the weight of it do what it needed to do, the way you let a wound bleed for a moment before you close it. After a while, Jun dropped his hands and looked up with eyes that were red and angry and ashamed and 22 years old and exactly as unfinished as he'd always been, and Min-jae felt something that he did not have language for and did not try to name. What happens now? Jun said. Min-jae looked at his watch. 2 hours and 30 minutes until 6 p.m. Now, he said, I need you to tell me everything Noah Beck told you about his plan. Jun looked at him. Everything, Min-jae said. Exact words if you can. Jun talked for 40 minutes. Min-jae sat across from him and listened without interrupting, without moving, with the particular quality of stillness he could produce when the information coming at him was important enough to require every available processor. He listened the way he'd learned to listen in rooms where the wrong reaction could end everything, absorbing, cataloging, building the architecture of what he was hearing into something he could navigate. Jun talked in the halting, stop-start cadence of someone excavating buried things. He talked about the first contact, 7 months ago, a message through a university acquaintance, someone Jun had trusted, a mutual friend who hadn't known what he was facilitating. He talked about the meetings, how Noah had started with history and not with asks, how he'd spent the first 2 months simply talking about Baek Chun-sik, building the portrait slowly, adding detail like layers of paint, each layer drying before the next went on. He talked about the documents, the photographs, the carefully curated record that made Kang Min-jae into a predator and Baek Chun-sik into a man who'd been trying to escape. He talked about the authentication codes, how Noah had framed it, not theft, not sabotage, but access. There are files buried in his financial system, records of what he did to your father. We just need to look. He talked about the money. He said the transfers were pulling evidence out of encrypted accounts, Jun said. His voice was steady now, had gone past the shaking into something colder and more deliberate, the voice of someone doing penance through precision. He said the money was a retrieval fee. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I knew it didn't make sense. I knew the numbers didn't line up with what he was telling me. I knew, and I didn't ask. Because you didn't want to know, Min-jae said. Jun looked at him. Yes. Min-jae nodded. No judgment in it. He understood the specific willfulness of not asking the question whose answer you can already feel. The plan, Min-jae said. What did he tell you about this week? He said there was going to be a meeting, a confrontation. He said he was going to force you to answer for what you did, publicly, in front of people who mattered, people whose opinion would matter to your business. Jun's jaw tightened. He didn't tell me about the driver. He didn't tell me about Gamcheon. A pause. He didn't tell me he was going to kill you. Min-jae held his gaze. Would it have changed things? The question sat in the air. Jun held it for a long moment, and his face went through something complicated and honest, and then he said, I don't know, maybe not then, maybe I was... He stopped. I was angry enough that maybe I wouldn't have stopped it. It was the most honest thing Jun had ever said to him. Min-jae felt the weight of it without flinching. What about Seo-ah? Min-jae said. Jun looked up sharply. What about her? Did he tell you she was involved? Something moved through Jun's face. Surprise, and behind the surprise, something that looked like rapid recalculation. No. He shook his head slowly. No, he never... I didn't know she was part of it. She is. Min-jae kept his voice flat. She's been part of it for 18 months. Jun stared at him. They're meeting in Gwangali in 2 hours, Min-jae said. That's where we're going. He stood up. Jun stayed seated for a moment, still processing, and then he stood too, unfolding his long frame from the chair with the particular clumsiness of someone whose body is ahead of their mind. What's the plan? Jun said. Seong-ho has a team on the cafe. We watch the meeting. We track where Beck goes when it ends. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. And then we finish this. How? Min-jae looked at him. His way, but on my timeline. They left the estate through the service road in a car Seong-ho had staged outside the perimeter, and Seong-ho was already in the driver's seat with his phone on the center console and the flat alert expression of a man who had been running operations for 40 years and had learned to keep his reactions subcutaneous. He glanced at June in the back seat without comment and pulled out onto the coast road and drove south toward the city. The call came at 5:41. Seong-ho answered it on the second ring, listened for exactly 8 seconds, said 2 words Min-jae couldn't catch, and ended the call. Then he put the phone down and looked in the rearview mirror and said, with a very specific quality of care, "There's a problem." Min-jae waited. "Seo-ah didn't go to Gwangali," Seong-ho said. "The lunch meeting with the foundation, we had eyes on the cafe from 2:30. She never arrived." He paused. "She left the estate at noon. Our team lost her in Yeonjae-gu. She used the subway." Another pause. "Someone planned for us to be watching Gwangali." Min-jae let that settle. It was a decoy. The cafe booking was made in her name 2 days ago. Real reservation, real credit card. But she was never going to be there. Seong-ho's voice was controlled and even and delivering each piece at measured pace. Beck knew we'd trace the contact and set a watch on wherever she was supposed to be. Min-jae was quiet. The coast road was moving past the window. The low buildings of the outer harbor district, the smell of salt coming through the vents, the city starting to go gold in the late afternoon light. "Where is she?" he said. "We're working on it. Cameras in Yeonjae-gu, cell tower. Her phone. Off. She pulled the battery." She'd pulled the battery. Min-jae sat with that fact. Seo-ah did not pull batteries out of phones. Seo-ah was meticulous and organized and careful, but the particular careful of a woman who moved through a protected life, not the careful of an operative. Someone had told her to pull the battery. Someone had coached her through this. "June," Seong-ho said, still looking in the rear view. "Did Beck ever mention a secondary location? Somewhere he'd go if the primary plan was disrupted?" June was very still in the back seat. He'd been very still since they'd gotten in the car, processing at whatever speed he processed at, and now he looked up and met Seong-ho's eyes in the mirror, and Min-jae could see him going through everything Noah had told him, pulling it apart for anything he'd not thought to mention. "He mentioned a warehouse," June said slowly. "Once, early on. He said—" He stopped. "He said his father had owned property in Busan before he died, that it was taken, along with everything else. He was talking about things he'd lost." Another pause. "He said sometimes he went there to think. He didn't give me an address." "District?" Seong-ho said. "Jonggu, I think. Or Donggu, near the old port." Seong-ho picked up his phone and made a call. Min-jae turned and looked out the front window and thought about what he knew about Baek Chun-sik's property holdings from 20 years ago. The things he'd liquidated, and the things that had been absorbed, and the things that had fallen through the cracks of legal process and simply sat, untended, title-clouded, belonging to no one properly. He thought about the decoy. He thought about the precision it required. Not just the reservation, not just the coaching, but the knowledge of how Min-jae would respond. The knowledge that Min-jae would pull Seong-ho's team and position them at Gwangali and feel like he had the situation held. The knowledge of how he thought, how he moved, how he structured a counter-operation. The level of knowledge that came from proximity, from time inside his life. He turned to look at June. June was watching him. Something had changed in his face in the last 60 seconds. A new quality of alarm, the alarm of someone arriving at a thought they don't want to arrive at. "What did you tell him about how I work?" Min-jae said. Quiet. No accusation in the tone, just the question, direct. June's jaw worked. "He asked about you, a lot. How you ran security, how you responded to threats, who you trusted." He stopped. "I told him you'd isolate and counter, that you'd rather set a trap than run." Min-jae held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the front window. Seong-ho's call ended. "There are 3 Beck family properties in the Junggu and Donggu registers that match the time period. 2 are now commercial. 1, he paused. 1 has been vacant for 18 years. cold storage facility in Choryangdong. The title went into probate when Baek Chun-sik died and has been sitting there since. That's it, Min-jae said. Min-jae, if he knows we're coming, he knows we're coming regardless. The decoy bought him time, not surprise. He thought for a moment. How many men do we have available right now? Clean. People who aren't in the compromised pool. 8. I've had them staged on standby since yesterday morning. Get them to Choryangdong. Stage them 3 blocks out. Nobody moves without my call. He paused. And I want someone back at the estate. Seong-ho glanced at him. The estate is secure. I checked the Amara, Min-jae said. A silence. Then, understood. They drove into the city as the last of the afternoon light went copper and flat across the rooftops. And Min-jae sat in the front seat and built the plan in his head, and took it apart and built it again, looking for the places where it could come apart at the seams. And every time he found a seam, he went back to the same fundamental problem. He didn't know how much Noah Baek knew, and he didn't know what position Seo-ah was in, and he didn't know what cards were still unplayed. He hated not knowing. He had spent 20 years constructing a life in which he knew, in which the information flowed to him in organized, reliable channels, and the variables were managed and the surprises were rare enough to be anomalies rather than conditions. He had paid for that knowledge with things he did not examine in detail, had made it the central project of his adult life, and now he was driving into the city with a plan full of holes and a son who'd been used as a tool and an enemy who had studied him the way you study something you intend to destroy. It occurred to him, as Seong-ho turned into the outer streets of Choryangdong, that this was possibly the most exposed he'd been in 20 years, and the only person who'd seen it coming was a 7-year-old girl with a toy recorder. Seong-ho parked 3 blocks from the address, and they sat in the car while the city went about its early evening business around them. Delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog, the distant sound of a restaurant exhaust fan running. Normal city sounds. Min-jae studied the block through the windshield. I'm going in, he said. Min-jae, if I wait for Baek to set the terms, we're reactive for the rest of this. We've been reactive since yesterday morning. He reached for the door handle. I set the terms. Then take someone. If I walk in there with a team, he'll know what I know and he'll adjust. I need him to think the decoy worked. I need him off balance. He paused with his hand on the handle. Call it in when I'm inside. If I'm not out in 30 minutes, bring everyone. He looked at June. Stay here. June looked back at him with the expression he'd had in the hallway, the decision that wasn't quite finished. No, he said. June. He used me. Flat. Final. I'm going. Min-jae held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he opened the car door. The Choryangdong cold storage facility was a low concrete building behind a chain-link fence, the concrete stained with 2 decades of salt air and neglect, the loading dock doors sealed with rust and a padlock that was newer than everything around it. Min-jae noted the new padlock as he approached and noted that the fence to the left of the main gate had been cut and bent back and rebent, imperfectly, someone's attempt at concealment. He went through the cut fence. June followed. The interior was dark, the kind of dark that takes a moment to resolve into shapes. The cold storage units along both walls, the ceiling high and industrial, the floor stained concrete. There was light coming from the back of the building, not strong, a work light or portable lamp, throwing hard shadows. Min-jae moved toward it with June at his shoulder, both of them keeping to the edge of the room, using the storage units for cover. His hand was on the gun at his hip. He hadn't drawn it yet. He heard Seo-ah's voice before he saw her. Said it went wrong. He didn't arrive. Her voice was low and controlled, the voice he'd heard in the kitchen this morning, but stripped of the morning's warmth. The driver didn't make contact. A man's voice. I know. Our man got made. Then what is the point of... The point, the man said, is that he'll come to us now. He can't not. Min-jae came around the corner of the last storage unit. The work light was on the floor in the center of the back room, throwing light upward, making the faces above it strange and harsh. Seo-ah stood with her back to the wall, still in the clothes she'd left the house in. Beside her, one hand on a table stacked with equipment cases, communications gear, Min-jae cataloged automatically, and weapons, stood a man he'd never seen in person before but whose jaw and posture and the exact flatness of his eyes matched the partial photograph from the cafe table. Noah Baek was 36 years old and looked it in the way some men do, not aged, but calcified, hardened by years of singular purpose into something that had lost the softness of anything unrelated to that purpose. He was roughly Min Jae's height, leaner, in dark clothing, and he was looking at Min Jae with an expression of absolutely no surprise. "Faster than I thought," Noah said. "Your decoy was good," Min Jae said. "Not good enough." Noah's eyes moved to June. Something passed through them, complicated, quickly contained. "June," he said, and the name came out with a warmth that made Min Jae's teeth clench because it was real, or near enough to real that the distinction barely mattered. Whatever Noah felt about June, it wasn't nothing. June said nothing. Seoa had gone still against the wall. She was looking at Min Jae, and her face was doing that thing again. The fractional rearrangement, the micro-adjustments of someone managing what shows. But the management was cracking at the edges. She was afraid. Underneath everything, underneath the resolution and the planning and the 18 months of careful complicity, she was afraid. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and then looked away. "Where are your people?" Min Jae said to Noah. "Close." "How close?" "Closer than yours." Noah said it without heat, a statement of logistics. "I told you this morning, this isn't finished." "You told me you'd find my son." Min Jae glanced at June. "He found me." Something moved in Noah's face at that. "He told me everything," Min Jae continued. "The meetings, the documents, the codes, all of it." He watched Noah absorb this, watched him recalibrate in real time the small adjustments of a man who is discovering which of his foundations have been pulled. "You spent 7 months building him into something you could use. He walked into my house and gave me the architecture of everything you've built." Noah was quiet for a moment, then, "And you trust that? You trust him after knowing what he did?" "Yes, just like that." "He's my son," Min Jae said. "That's not a complicated calculation." Noah's jaw tightened. "He's not your son. He never was. He was a thing you took because taking things is what you do. You took his father. You took his history. You've spent 18 years taking his future without him even knowing it." "I spent 18 years raising a person," Min Jae said. "I know the difference looks the same from the outside when you need it to. You killed his father. I know what I did." No flinching in it, no apology, and no performance. "Your father died because of what he chose to do, not because of what I chose to do. Those are different things. You've spent 20 years treating them like the same thing." Noah looked at him with something past anger. Anger had an energy in it, and this was more tired than angry. The look of a man who has carried one thing for so long it has replaced everything else. "He was all I had." "I know," Min Jae said, and quieter. "So was June." The room was very still, and then Seoa spoke. She spoke in the quiet, final voice of someone who has decided that the shape of the moment requires something irreversible, and she said, "Noah, show him." Noah looked at her. Something passed between them. A full conversation in 2 seconds. The shorthand of people who have spent enough time planning together that they no longer need language for the crucial things. Then Noah reached into one of the equipment cases on the table and set a laptop on the surface and opened it and turned the screen toward Min Jae. Min Jae looked at the screen. The video was security footage, interior camera, high angle. He recognized the room immediately. His study, the study at the estate, the room he'd been sitting in an hour ago with Seong-ho's folder on the desk. The timestamp in the corner read 14 months ago. In the footage, Min Jae watched himself sit down at his desk, watched himself open his laptop, watched himself make a phone call. He knew the call. He remembered it. It had been a routine operational call, a logistics discussion with one of his regional managers about a shipping contract. That was not what Noah was showing him. Noah reached over and fast-forwarded the footage 4 minutes, and Min Jae watched himself on screen reach into the desk drawer and remove a document and sign it and replace it. He didn't remember signing anything 14 months ago on that afternoon. He had been in Seoul 14 months ago on that afternoon. He had been in Seoul for 3 days. He had documentation. He had people who could verify. "The feed is spliced," Min Jae said. His voice was very flat. "That's not real footage." "Your own estate cameras," Noah said. "Your own timestamps." "I wasn't in that room 14 months ago. I was in Seoul." There are 3 people in that room who will say otherwise. Noah's voice was even and careful, delivering something he'd constructed with deliberate workmanship. There's a notarized document that puts you at your estate on that date, signed by 2 members of your household staff. And the document you signed in that footage? He let the implication finish itself. Min-jae looked at the screen. He looked at the footage of himself doing something he had not done, in a room he had not been in, on a date he could account for. "What's on the document?" he said. "An order," Seoa said. Her voice was quiet and without inflection now, the last layer of performance stripped away. "For the disposal of 3 men who were later found in the harbor." He knew the case. 3 low-level operatives found in the harbor 15 months ago. The investigation had gone cold. No leads, no suspects. The kind of case that went cold because the people who might have had information had reasons to stay quiet. He had not ordered those deaths. And he had never been able to identify who had. And the investigation had been one of Seong-ho's long-standing open files. He looked at Seoa. She looked back at him without expression, without apology, with the absolute steady quality of a woman who had passed the point of second thought so long ago they were no longer visible on the horizon. "You killed them," he said. She said nothing. "You killed 3 men and put my name on the order." He kept his voice level. It cost him something significant. "Why?" "Because I needed something that would hold," she said. "Something a court couldn't dismiss. Something with physical evidence and witnesses and documentation." She paused. "Something that would make what I was doing look like justice instead of—" She stopped. "Instead of what it actually is," Min-jae said. She said nothing. He stood in the concrete room under the industrial ceiling with the work light throwing hard shadows upward and looked at his wife of 11 years, and he felt the full weight of it land. Not the betrayal, which he'd been carrying since the recording, but the depth of the investment in it. She hadn't just helped Noah Bayek. She had built the scaffolding. She had murdered 3 men and constructed a false record and spent a year and a half preparing the architecture of his destruction. That level of commitment did not come from nowhere. "How long?" he said. She knew what he was asking. 3 years, she said. 3 years before Noah Beck. 3 years before the first contact, the first meeting. "Before him," Min-jae said. "Yes." "You'd already decided." "I'd already decided." The room was completely silent. Noah was watching the exchange with an expression Min-jae couldn't read. Not triumph, something more complicated. The expression of a man watching something he'd planned unfold and discovering it doesn't feel the way he'd anticipated. "The footage goes to every syndicate leader you were supposed to meet," Noah said. "Every regional partner. Every law enforcement contact who's been maintaining a careful distance. It goes everywhere and—" He checked his watch. 40 minutes. "Unless I make a call." Min-jae looked at him. "Walk away," Noah said. "Leave Busan. Leave the country. Dismantle the organization. Every piece, every account, every operation. You have 72 hours. He paused. "Or the footage goes out, and you spend whatever time you have left trying to survive what comes after." The 40 minutes on the clock. The 8 men staged 3 blocks away. The footage, which was fabricated but which had been constructed with the resources of 18 months and the intimate knowledge of someone who had lived inside his life, and which would be believed by people who were already looking for a reason to move against him. And Seo-ah, against the wall, watching him with the specific patience of a woman who had run a very long calculation and was waiting for the result. Min-jae stood very still. Beside him, June was rigid with a quality of controlled fury that Min-jae could feel without touching him, the fury of someone who understands precisely how they were used and is cataloging it in real time, filing it somewhere permanent. The clock was running. And Kang Min-jae looked at Noah Baek across the concrete room and understood, with complete clarity, that the man standing across from him had prepared for every version of this conversation except one. He had not prepared for Min-jae to smile. It was not a warm smile. It did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who has just identified the exact nature of a trap and recognized simultaneously that the trap has a flaw, and that the flaw is the person who built. The flaw was the phone. Noah had said, "Unless I make a call," which meant the footage wasn't on an automated timer. which meant it required a human action to release. Which meant Noah Bach, for all his 20 years of patience and 18 months of architecture, had built his final leverage around a single point of failure: himself. Min-jae smiled because a man who has to make a call can be stopped from making it. He smiled for exactly 2 seconds, and then he moved. Not toward Noah, toward the lamp on the floor. He kicked it sideways with the flat of his foot, and the room went dark, and everything that followed happened in the specific compressed chaos of a space that has lost its light. Sound first, the scrape of boots on concrete as Noah moved, Seoa's sharp intake of breath, the clatter of something hitting a storage unit. Min-jae was already low, already moving toward where Noah had been standing, navigating by the floor plan he'd spent 30 seconds committing to memory when they'd first come around the corner. His shoulder hit something solid, a body, not Noah's, wrong height, and he drove his elbow up and connected with a jaw, and the body went down, and Min-jae kept moving. There were more people in the room than he'd counted. Noah's close had meant very close. "June!" "Left wall," he said, loud enough to be heard, and he heard June move. Gunfire would mean noise and police and a timeline he couldn't manage, and Noah knew that too, which meant the first 30 seconds were going to be hands and elbows and whatever surfaces were available, everyone feeling through the dark for a position that made sense. Min-jae understood this geometry. He'd been in dark rooms before. He found the table by feel, ran his hand along the edge, found the equipment cases, shoved them toward where he estimated Noah's position was. He heard them hit something and heard a curse and moved toward the curse and got his hand around a wrist that was trying to get to a jacket pocket, and he yanked the arm across his body and applied pressure to the elbow joint until the joint told him it was done. Not Noah. He could tell by the build, 2 down. Light came back into the room from a phone screen. Noah's, held up. The light was pale and directional and threw more shadow than clarity, but it was enough. Noah was 7 feet away with a gun up and his eyes locked on Min-jae's face, and his face had lost the controlled quality it had carried through the whole conversation. It was rawer now, closer to the surface. "Stop," Noah said. Min-jae stopped. Behind him he could hear June, not moving, which meant he'd found the wall or found a problem. "Hands," Noah said. Min-jae raised his hands to shoulder height. He looked at Noah over the gun with an expression that was flat and patient and gave nothing. "The smile," Noah said. "What was that?" "I figured something out." "What?" "You have to make a call," Min-jae said. "You have to physically initiate the release, which means you didn't want it automatic, which means you're still deciding whether to use it." Noah's jaw tightened. "You built yourself an exit," Min-jae said. "The footage is the exit. If I capitulate, you use it as ongoing leverage. I dismantle, and you hold the footage as insurance that I stay dismantled. If I fight, you release it, and I'm too busy surviving the aftermath to come after you." He paused. "But you didn't make it automatic because you're not certain yet which version you want." "I know exactly what I want." "Then your hand wouldn't be doing that," Min-jae said. The phone screen in Noah's offhand was shaking, just slightly, just enough. "The men your wife killed," Noah said. "The 3 in the harbor. You really didn't order that." "No." "Does it matter at this point?" "To you, apparently." Something shifted in Noah's face. A fault line, briefly visible, then covered. "She came to me," he said. 2 years before we made contact with you. I didn't recruit her. She found me." Min-jae said nothing. She'd been building the documentation for a year before that. The footage, the witnesses. She had it ready before she ever contacted me. Noah's voice had flattened into something that might have been its own version of honesty. The honesty of a man who has discovered that his righteousness is more complicated than he assembled it. "I told myself it was justice." She told herself something else. What did she tell herself? Noah looked at him for a moment. "Ask her." From the back of the room, from the wall where she'd been standing through all of it, Seoa said, "I told myself it was survival." Min-jae turned his head toward her voice. She was still against the wall, not moving, her hands at her sides. "Survival from what?" he said. "From you." Not viciously, quietly. From the thing you were becoming. From what it was making me. She paused. "I watched you for 11 years, Min-jae. I watched what this All of this cost. What it cost you. What it cost anyone near you. Another pause. I didn't want to be near it anymore, and there was no clean way out, and then I found Noah, and I told myself it was justice, and I knew it wasn't. The room was very still. Minjae looked at her for a moment. And the three men. She said nothing. You killed 3 people, he said, to build a case. Yes. And you're telling me that was survival. She looked at him, and her eyes were clear and steady, and he understood suddenly that she was not afraid in the way he'd read it earlier. She was tired. She was profoundly, structurally tired, the way a building is tired before it comes down. No, she said. That was something else. Noah's gun had not moved. His phone had not moved. The 30 minutes on Minjae's internal clock had burned through 20 of them, and Seong-ho's team was 3 blocks away, and somewhere outside the building, the city was continuing its evening business with complete indifference. Baek. Minjae brought his eyes back to Noah. The footage goes out, and the syndicates move. You know what that looks like. You know how many people are involved in those operations, how many of them aren't like me, how many of them are worse than me. You release that footage, and you don't end one criminal empire. You destabilize 6 of them simultaneously in the same region. He held Noah's gaze. Your father's people are in 2 of those networks. You know that. A pause. I know. Then you know what happens to them. I know. Noah's voice was flat and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the current hour. I've known for a while. And you're still going to do it. I don't know what I'm going to do. The gun was steady, but the voice behind it wasn't, not anymore, and Minjae could hear the fault line in it clearly now. The place where 20 years of singular purpose had brought Noah back to a room in Choryangdong and given him everything he'd built toward and left him not certain he wanted it. I've been building toward this for 20 years, and I'm standing here, and I don't... His phone rang. Not the phone in his gun hand, a second phone, in his jacket pocket. And the ringtone was sudden and wrong, and it pulled Noah's attention for half a second. Just half a second. The involuntary flinch of a sound you aren't expecting in a moment requiring total attention. Half a second was enough. Minjae closed the 7 feet. What followed was not a fight in any clean sense of the word. It was 2 men at very close range with a gun between them and everything at stake. And it was brutal and graceless, and the sounds it made were the sounds of physical effort and impact, and the specific vocalizations of pain. The gun discharged once into the ceiling, a sound like the building had been hit with something large, the echo rolling through the concrete space and back again, ears ringing after. Minjae took an elbow across the cheekbone that set off a white flash behind his left eye and felt his grip on Noah's gun wrist slip and recovered it and drove Noah back against the table, and the table went over and equipment cases hit the floor with a crash. He got the gun. He stepped back. Noah was on one knee on the floor, breathing hard, one hand braced on the overturned table. He looked up at Minjae with the gun now pointed at him, and his face was altered. Something had cracked open, the last of the constructed surface, and what was underneath was 20 years old and tired and looked more than anything like grief. Shoot me, Noah said. His voice was wrecked. Or don't. I'm done running the calculation. Minjae looked at him. His cheekbone was throbbing, and he could taste something metallic at the corner of his mouth, and his left eye was watering involuntarily from the impact. He stood with the gun on Noah's back and breathed through his nose and thought about calculations. Where's the footage? He said. Encrypted drive. In the case. Noah nodded toward the overturned equipment case on the floor. The release requires a 12-digit code and a biometric. He paused. Mine. If you don't input it in the next... Minjae checked his watch. 8 minutes. What happens? Nothing. It sits there. It doesn't auto-release? No. A pause. I told you. I hadn't decided. Minjae lowered the gun to his side. Not fully, not holstering it, just no longer pointing it. The decision happened in the 3 seconds after that. He didn't articulate it. It didn't require articulation. He looked at Noah back on the floor of a concrete room in Choryangdong and understood with the completeness of a man finally seeing something that has been true for longer than he wanted to admit, that this, all of it, this room, this night, this 20-year accumulation of cause and effect, was the harvest of his own fields. He had killed Baek Chun-sik. He had not been wrong to do it. Both of those things were true, and neither of them negated the other, and the second one had made the first one inevitable. "Get up," he said to Noah. Noah looked at him. "Get up." Not unkindly, just the fact of it. His phone buzzed. "Seong-ho, 30 minutes. I'm coming in." He texted back, "Stand by." He heard June behind him moving. He turned. Joan was standing near the left wall with one of Noah's men, the one who'd been in the dark, the one Min-jae hadn't seen, on the floor at his feet in a position that suggested he was not going to be useful for a while. June's right hand was bleeding, split across the knuckles, and he was breathing in the effortful way of someone who has been physical and is coming down from it. He looked at Noah on the floor, then at Min-jae. "What are we doing?" he said. "Working on it," Min-jae said. From the wall, Seo-ah said, "I'll cooperate." Her voice was the same as it had been. Quiet, stripped, the voice of a woman who has exhausted the version of herself that performed other things. "Whatever you need me to do, the witnesses, the documentation, the staff I bribed, I'll put it all in writing." "Why?" Min-jae said. "Because I'm tired." A pause. "And because what I did to those 3 men," she stopped. "That doesn't become all right because of what I was trying to do." Min-jae looked at her. He held the look for a long time, long enough that she had to work to maintain it, and she did. She held his gaze, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked. "Seong-ho will come in," he said. "When he does, you go with him." She nodded once. He turned back to Noah, who had gotten to his feet and was standing with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he believes is already written. "The drive," Min-jae said. "I want you to destroy it yourself." Noah looked at him. And then you and I have a conversation. Not here. Not tonight." He paused. "You spent 20 years building a case against me. I want you to hear the other half of it. All of it. Things you won't be able to verify and things you will, and then you decide what you want to do with it. And if I decide you're still wrong, then you decide I'm still wrong," Min-jae said. "But you decide it with the whole story." Noah stared at him. The grief in his face had not moved. It had settled in, the way grief does when it finally gets to stop pretending to be something else. "Why?" "Because you were 16, Min-jae said. "And someone should have explained it to you then, and no one did, and that's one of the things I'm going to have to account for." The room was very quiet. Then Noah crossed to the equipment case, crouched, and pulled out the encrypted drive. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it, and Min-jae watched what it cost him. The 20 years of it, the thing this small piece of hardware represented, the architecture of purpose he'd built his entire adult life around. And he didn't look away from the cost of it. Noah set the drive on the concrete floor. He stood, he brought his heel down. The drive cracked on the first impact. He hit it 3 more times with a methodical violence that had nothing theatrical in it, just the physical fact of destruction. And then he stepped back and looked at the pieces on the floor, and his face was very still. Min-jae's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen. Not Seong-ho. A number he didn't recognize. And beneath it, a text message that came from Seong-ho's secondary line, routed through. He checked the prefix. The estate's internal system. The message read, "East Garden. Compound breach. 2 men. The girl." Min-jae read the message twice. The world went very quiet. He had sent someone back to the estate. He had told Seong-ho, Amara, and Seong-ho had said understood, and he had believed that was handled because Seong-ho handled things, because that was the agreement, because the compound was secure, because his hands had not done anything visible, his face had not done anything visible. But something had happened behind his eyes that June, standing 6 feet away, saw and responded to before Min-jae said a word. "What?" June said. Min-jae was already dialing. The call to the estate picked up on the first ring, and the voice that answered was one of his security staff. And the voice was doing the thing voices do when they are reporting something. They know is catastrophic and are trying to deliver it at a speed and in a format that is professional and useful. And the content underneath the professionalism was that 2 men had come through the east perimeter at the garden wall, the same wall where the bulbul nested. And the groundskeeper, David Johnson, had been struck and was down, and the girl, "Where is she?" Min-jae said. His voice was completely level. It required everything he had to keep it level. "They took her," the man on the phone said. "We have it on camera. They took her and they went back through the east wall toward the coast road. We're tracking the vehicle, but—" Min-jae ended the call. He looked at Noah. Noah's face had gone wrong. Something was happening in it that Min-jae couldn't read immediately, and then he could— Noah hadn't known. Whatever play this was, Noah's face said he hadn't planned it. "Who else knew about tonight?" Min-jae said. His voice was still level, and it was costing him something real to keep it that way, something he was drawing from reserves he didn't know the size of. "Who else knew you were using this location?" "No one," Noah said. "Two people. Both of them are in this room." "Then someone followed one of you." Min-jae looked at Seoa. She shook her head. "I lost any tail when I pulled the battery." "You think you lost it?" Her face went pale. "There are people in your network you didn't build," Min-jae said to Noah. "People you inherited, people who came through other channels, people who have their own interests in how this ends." He paused. "Who in the last 6 months has come to you and offered help that you didn't ask for?" Noah was very still. "Who?" Min-jae said. Noah said a name, and Min-jae recognized it, and the recognition was the specific recognition of a man who has just identified the variable he missed, the piece that had been in the room the entire time in a form he hadn't correctly classified, and the wrongness of it moved through him like cold water and settled in his chest, and he breathed through it, and he did not let it out. "Get in the car," he said to June. "Min-jae, now." He looked at Noah. "You're coming. You know this person. I need that." He looked at Seoa. "You stay here. Seong-ho's team will be here in 5 minutes. He picked up Noah's gun from where it had ended up on the floor and put it in his jacket. "Don't move from this building." He was already moving toward the exit. June caught up with him before he reached the door. They moved through the dark of the storage facility at a pace just below running, and Min-jae's cheekbone was throbbing with a deep, persistent ache, and his left eye was still watering, and the taste of blood was still at the corner of his mouth. And none of it registered as important information, because the only information that registered right now was a 7-year-old girl in a yellow windbreaker and 2 men in a vehicle on the coast road, and the cold calculation of how much time had passed since the breach. He called Seong-ho as they came out into the evening air. "I know," Seong-ho said before Min-jae spoke. "I have the plate. We're tracking." "Where?" "Coast Road south toward Min-jae. They're going toward Gamcheon, the Gamcheon terminal. The same abandoned container yard from yesterday morning. The same location that had been set up once already as a place where Kang Min-jae was supposed to die. Someone was very committed to that location." "Who set up Gamcheon originally?" Min-jae said. "Not Noah." "Who arranged the logistics, the personnel, the timing?" Seong-ho was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I've been looking at that all day. The operational coordination, it came through a handler in Osaka." "The Osaka Syndicate," Min-jae said. "The meeting we postponed." "Yes. The meeting that gave us cover to run this entire operation tonight because they thought I was dead and the power structure was open." He reached the car. Noah was already in the back, getting in without being told, which meant he'd arrived at the same answer. "Someone is using both of us." "Min-jae," Seong-ho said, and his voice had gone to that specific flat-controlled register. "The girl! Why take the girl? She's not leverage against Noah. She's not leverage against June. She's leverage against me," Min-jae said. He got into the driver's seat. "They've been watching the estate, long enough to see me sit with her in the garden, long enough to read what that looks like." "A 7-year-old, Seong-ho said. "I know." He started the car. "Get everyone to Gamcheon, every person we have that I trust. I don't care what it looks like." "How far behind are you?" Min-jae looked at the clock on the dash. Calculated. 12 minutes, he said. Maybe less. He pulled out of the alley behind the storage facility and accelerated into the evening city, and the city moved past on both sides with its normal evening business. And he drove. And beside him, June was white-knuckled on the door handle, and behind him, Noah Bake was looking straight ahead with the expression of a man who has destroyed everything he built in one night and is still trying to decide whether that makes him free or finished. And the coast road came up, and Min-jae took the turn at a speed that made the tires complain and pushed the car south toward the harbor. The rain started 6 minutes from Gamcheon. Not gradually. It arrived the way serious rain arrives on the coast, all at once. The sky releasing something it had been holding, hard enough that the wipers at full speed barely kept the windshield clear. The road went black and slick, and the harbor lights ahead blurred and wavered through the water on the glass. Min-jae drove through it without slowing. His phone was on the console between the seats, and it buzzed once, and he looked at the screen, and the message was from a number he'd never seen, and it was not a text. It was a photograph. And the photograph was Amara Johnson, sitting on the concrete floor of what was identifiably the Gamcheon terminal, and she was looking directly at the camera with the serious, unperformed expression. She turned on everything. And she was not crying, and she did not look terrified. And something about that specificity, the fact that she was looking at the camera with exactly the same quality of attention she turned on bird nests and broken fountains, was the thing that finally made something inside Min-jae Kang crack along its oldest seam. He picked up the phone and looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then he put it face down on the console and drove. The Gamcheon terminal appeared through the rain ahead, the chain-link fence and the container stacks visible in the wash of the headlights. And Min-jae cut the lights 100 meters out and came off the engine and let the car roll to a stop at the edge of the broken road. And the rain hammered the roof and the windows and made the world 20 feet past the glass into a gray shifting wall of nothing. "How many?" June said. His voice was tight and controlled, and it cost him. "Unknown," Min-jae said. "Could be 3. Could be 12. He looked in the rear view at Noah. "The handler in Osaka. What do you know about him?" Noah met his eyes in the mirror. "Enough to know he didn't bring 12 people to a container yard in the rain." A pause. 3 or 4. He's efficient. He doesn't like waste." "Good." Min-jae reached into his jacket and checked the gun. Full. He put it back. "You stay here," he said to Noah. "No." He turned to look at Noah directly. Noah's face in the dark car, lit only by the ambient glow of rain-blurred harbor lights, was set and certain in a way it hadn't been back in the storage facility. Something had reorganized in him during the drive. The 20 years of singular purpose had found a new direction, and it was pointed at the Gamcheon terminal and whatever was inside it. "She's in there because of me," Noah said, "because of what I built and who I let into it." He held Min-jae's gaze. "I'm going." Min-jae looked at him. "He's right," June said quietly. Min-jae looked at his son. Rain on the windows, the harbor beyond the glass going gray and black and white in the storm. "Stay close," he said. He opened the door and the rain hit him immediately, cold and total, soaking through his jacket in seconds, and he moved toward the terminal gate with the gun out and the rain in his eyes and 2 men at his back. And the rust and salt smell of the container yard came up strong through the wet. And somewhere inside the stacked steel corridors of the terminal, a little girl was sitting on a concrete floor looking at a camera with the same expression she turned on everything. And Kang Min-jae moved through the rain toward the gate and the darkness beyond it, and felt something that was not anger and not grief, and not the cold operational flatness he'd spent 20 years cultivating. It was older than any of those things. It was the thing that had made him pick up a 4-year-old boy from a burning building. He went through the gate. The rain came down on rusted steel, and the harbor shifted black below the cliffs, and somewhere ahead in the corridor between the stacked containers, a light was burning, and Min-jae moved toward it with his finger on the trigger and the rain. The corridor between the containers was 30 feet wide, and the rain came straight down into it without wind to angle it, just vertical and relentless, turning the concrete floor into a shallow, moving sheet of black water that reflected nothing. Min-jae moved through it with the gun at his side, and his left eye still half swollen from the impact in the storage facility, and the taste of blood still at the corner of his mouth, and the light ahead was a single work lamp hung on a hook driven into the side of a container. The same setup as the facility in Choryangdong, the same efficiency, and he registered this and filed it. He heard Amara before he saw her, not crying, not calling out. The sound she was making was quieter than that and more unsettling. She was talking. Low, steady, conversational, the way she talked to bird nests and broken fountains. And as Min-jae cleared the last corner, he understood she was talking to the man standing 6 feet from her, a man in dark clothing with his back to the corridor entrance and a phone in his hand, and she was describing, in the patient and detailed manner of a child who has decided the most useful response to an alarming situation is information, the migratory patterns of the brown-eared bulbul. They don't go far, she was saying. Only about 200 kilometers. Most birds that size go further, but the bulbul is territorial, so it stays close to the same. The man turned when he heard Min Jae's footstep in the water. He was 50 years old, Min Jae estimated, with the build and the posture of someone who had spent decades in operational roles, the specific compactness of a man who has learned to take up exactly the amount of space he needs and no more. He had a gun up before he finished turning, but Min Jae's was already there, had been there, and they stood in the rain in the container corridor with their weapons on each other and the work lamp throwing hard light between them. Amara looked at Min Jae. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "There are two more," she said. "One went that way." She tilted her head to the right. "One is behind you somewhere. I heard him when they brought me in." Min Jae did not take his eyes off the man in front of him. "Thank you, Amara." The man, the Osaka handler, the name Noah had given him in the car, was Makoto Aida, a name Min Jae now connected to 3 years of careful distance and strategic positioning within the regional network, looked at Min Jae with the professional assessment of someone reading a tactical situation. His eyes moved to the corridor entrance behind Min Jae and came back. "You came without your team," Ida said. His Korean was precise and slightly formal, the Korean of someone who learned it as a working language rather than a native one. "My team is outside," Min Jae said. "Then why come in alone?" "Because she's 7 years old," Min Jae said, "and I didn't want to wait." Something moved in Ida's face. Not softness, the man didn't carry softness in any accessible place, but a recalibration. He'd expected something different. The expected move was Seong-ho's team pouring through the gate, numbers and force, the standard response to a hostage situation from a man with resources. Min Jae walking through the rain alone was not the expected move. "The footage is destroyed," Min Jae said. "Noah Baek is in my custody. Your play is finished." "My play," Ida said, "was never Noah Baek." "I know," Min Jae said. "Noah Baek was the instrument. The play was the power vacuum. My organization destabilized, the regional meeting disrupted, the Osaka network positioned to absorb the pieces." He paused. "You've been running Noah for longer than he knew, since before he made contact with my wife." Ida looked at him, a long, measuring look, then, "He genuinely wanted to destroy you." "I know. I just made it useful." "I know that too." Min Jae kept the gun level and kept his voice level, and kept his left eye open despite the swelling that wanted to close it. "He's going to know it as well, soon." Something happened in Ida's face at that, a brief, genuine discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has treated other people's pain as operational material and does not enjoy being seen doing it. It passed quickly. "What do you want?" Ida said. "Walk away from this building," Min Jae said. "Call your 2 people and walk away. Tonight. Leave Busan tonight." Ida was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's it tonight," Min Jae said. "What comes later is a different conversation." "And the girl?" "She walks out with me right now." Ida looked at Amara. She looked back at him with the same expression she turned on everything, patient and categorizing and without performance. He held the look for a moment, and then he lowered his gun. He made a call. 2 words into the phone, clipped, and then he pocketed it and looked at Min Jae. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," Min Jae said. Ida walked past him toward the corridor entrance, close enough that Min Jae could have reached out and grabbed him, and he didn't, and Ida moved past without hurrying, and his footsteps went away through the water and the rain swallowed the sound of them. Min Jae holstered his gun. He crossed to Amara in 3 steps and crouched down in front of her, putting himself at her eye level the way he'd done in the hallway on the morning this had all started, and he looked at her face, checking. The way you check something you were afraid of losing, systematically, making sure all of it was there and unharmed. She looked back at him. Her yellow windbreaker was wet through. Her shoes were soaked. She had a small abrasion on her right palm, the kind that comes from catching yourself on rough concrete, and it had bled a little and dried. She was completely composed. "Are you hurt?" he said. She considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "My hand," she said. "I fell when they came over the wall." She held it up to show him. "It's not bad." "Okay." "My dad," she said. He's going to be all right, Min-jae said. He didn't actually know this yet. He made a note to know it within the next 5 minutes. I'll make sure of it. She nodded. Then she said, the man was going to use me to make you do something. Yes. Was it going to work? Min-jae looked at her. Her face in the work lamp light was serious and unsentimental and asking a genuine question, the way she asked everything. Yes, he said. She absorbed this. That's a lot of power for a little kid to have, she said. He stood up and took off his jacket and put it around her shoulders, even though it was soaking wet, because it was something to do, because the alternative was standing in a container yard in the rain with nothing to do with his hands, and then he took her hand, the uninjured one, and walked back through the corridor toward the gate. June met them at the entrance to the last corridor. He'd been there for some time. He was soaked through, and there was blood on his right hand that had spread from the knuckles. And there was another man on the ground 6 feet behind him that Min-jae didn't ask about. He looked at Amara, and something moved through his face that was too large and too unfinished to name. She's okay, Min-jae said. June looked at Amara. You're bleeding, she said to him, looking at his hand with the same systematic attention. I know, he said. You should clean it. I will. They went through the gate. Seong-ho's vehicles were pulled up 30 meters out, headlights cutting through the rain, and Seong-ho himself was standing at the front of the lead car, and when he saw Amara, he did something that Min-jae had never seen the old man do in 40 years. He closed his eyes for 1 second and pressed his lips together and stood that way for just a moment before he opened them again and walked toward them. David Johnson, Min-jae said, conscious. 2 men are with him at Bongseng Hospital. The strike was to the back of the head. They're running scans. The doctor believes it's a concussion. Min-jae looked down at Amara. Your father's at the hospital. He woke up. He's asking about you. The composure cracked then, finally, not dramatically. No crying, no collapse, just a sudden thinning of the surface, her face going younger and smaller, the face of a 7-year-old who has held something together for several hours because there was no useful alternative and is now allowing itself to stop. She tightened her grip on his hand. He lifted her. She was light and wet, and she put her face against his shoulder and was quiet. He carried her to the car. Noah Beck was still in the back seat where they'd left him. He looked at Amara when Min-jae opened the door, at the child in the soaking jacket and the dried blood on her palm, and he looked at her with the specific, undefended look of a man confronting the cost of his construction. The handler in Osaka, Min-jae said to him, standing in the rain at the open car door. Ida, how long has he been running you? Noah's jaw worked. I don't know. Guess. From the beginning, Noah said quietly. I thought I found him. I think he found me. A pause. He had resources I couldn't explain. Access to things I didn't ask how he got. I told myself I didn't care because he was useful. He looked at Amara again. I told myself a lot of things. Min-jae got in the car with Amara and closed the door. He sat in the passenger seat with a 7-year-old girl who weighed nothing asleep against his shoulder. She'd gone out almost immediately, the particular collapse of a child who has used everything up. And he looked out the rain-blurred windshield at the Gamcheon terminal and the harbor beyond it and the black water of the sea past the cliffs, and he breathed. Seong-ho got in and drove without being told where. He drove to the hospital first. David Johnson was in a room on the 3rd floor with a bandage around his head and the particular gray pallor of a man who has recently frightened himself badly. And when Amara walked through the door, dry now, in a hospital blanket someone had found, her field guide tucked under her arm because Seong-ho's man had found it on the ground near the garden wall and brought it. His face did what faces do when something comes back that you weren't sure was coming back, and he pulled her against him and held her and made the sounds that people make in those moments, low and wordless and not for anyone else. Min-jae stood in the doorway and watched. He stood there for a while. Then he went down to the lobby and sat in a chair by the window and looked at the rain-wet street outside and let the night catch up with him. The swollen cheekbone, the cut arm from the day before, which had reopened somewhere in the storage facility and dried again. The general deep exhaustion of a man who has not slept properly in 2 days and has spent those 2 days in the kind of sustained high alert that burns through reserves the way a fire burns through dry wood. June found him there 20 minutes later and sat down in the adjacent chair without a word. They sat side by side looking at the wet street, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city was doing what cities do at that hour. The particular late-night rhythm of emptied streets and the occasional set of headlights and the distant sound of something mechanical. "Where does it go from here?" June said. Min-jae thought about it. "Ida goes back to Osaka. He knows I know. He'll spend the next several months recalibrating, deciding whether another move is worth the cost. It probably isn't. He used his best opportunity and it didn't take." A pause. "That buys time." "Time for what?" "For the organization to change shape." He looked at the wet street. "The meeting that was supposed to happen. It'll happen. In 2 weeks, maybe 3. And the proposal I was bringing to that meeting is going to be different than the one I had before." June looked at him. "Different how?" "The logistics network I was building. I was going to use it to consolidate, make the operations larger, more efficient, more centralized." He paused. "That's not what I'm going to use it for." "Then what?" "I haven't worked out all of it yet." Min-jae looked at his hands. The cut on his forearm was visible below the torn shirt cuff. But the shape of it is smaller, cleaner, things that don't require what the other things required. He turned the thought over, careful with it. "I'm not going to tell you it becomes legitimate overnight. It doesn't. But the direction changes." June was quiet for a moment. "Because of tonight. Because of a lot of things that have been accumulating for a long time." He looked at June. "Because your mother wasn't wrong about everything." June's face tightened. "She killed 3 people." "Yes." "She spent 3 years planning to destroy you." "Yes." "And she wasn't wrong about everything. She wasn't wrong that the thing I was building was consuming everything around it." Min-jae held his gaze. "She was wrong about the method. She was wrong to do what she did to those 3 men, and she's going to answer for it, and that's not negotiable. But the thing she saw that made her decide she needed to leave, she saw it clearly." June looked at the window. Outside a car moved through the wet street slowly, headlights reflecting in the puddles. "What happens to her?" he said. "She cooperates. Everything she documented, everything she built, the witnesses, the bribed staff, the false records, she walks through all of it with Seong-ho, and we dismantle it piece by piece." Min-jae paused. "The 3 men she killed. Their families get taken care of, properly, anonymously, in a way that doesn't implicate anyone. That's the cost, and she agreed to it. And then she goes somewhere quiet, and she stays there." A pause. "I'm not going to pretend that's justice. It isn't, not cleanly, but it's the most that's available right now." June thought about that. "And Noah?" Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "I told him I'd give him the full story. I'm going to do that. What he does with it afterward..." He paused. "I don't know. He's got nowhere to go. The thing he built his life around is gone. Ida used him, and he knows it now, and that knowledge is its own kind of damage." He looked at his hands again. "I'm not going to help him rebuild what he had, but I'm not going to leave him with nothing." "Why?" June said. "Because he was 16, Min-jae said. And I keep coming back to that. He was 16 years old and his father died and no one told him the truth, and he spent 20 years filling the space where the truth should have been with something that destroyed him." A pause. "I made him that way. Not entirely. Not alone. But I made him that way." They sat in the hospital lobby for another hour. The rain stopped sometime during it. The sky outside the window went from black to a deep gray, the first intimation of a dawn that was still several hours away but was already changing the quality of the dark. Seong-ho came down from the room. He sat in the 3rd chair, on the other side of Min-jae, and for a while the 3 of them were silent together, which was its own kind of communication between people who have been through something together and don't yet have the language for it. "The staff who were compromised," Seong-ho said eventually. "Paid out. Full severance, no record. They were scared people who made scared decisions. The guards who were replaced. Same. The men who impersonated them. That's a different matter. Seong-ho, I'll need you to handle that, and I don't need the details." The old man nodded. "Woo-bin," Min-jae said. "Resting at home. His wife knows there was an incident. She doesn't know the nature of it." Seong-ho paused. "He wants to come back to work." "He can come back when he's ready." Min-jae looked at the old man. and I need a conversation with the 4 syndicate leaders. Private, before the meeting. There are things they need to hear from me directly, before they hear anything else. About tonight. About the direction. He paused. About the fact that the organization they've been doing business with is going to look different in 2 years than it does today, and that they can come along or find other arrangements, but they're not going to be surprised by it. Seong-ho held his gaze. He held it for a long time, the look of a man reading something he's been waiting to see for a while, and isn't certain he's reading correctly. What happened tonight? He said carefully. Nothing that wasn't already happening, Min-jae said. I just ran out of reasons to put it off. The old man looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, the single nod that for Seong-ho was the equivalent of a longer statement, and he stood up and went to make calls. Min-jae sat with June in the emptying lobby as the night began its slow dissolution toward morning, and he thought about the things that were finished and the things that weren't, and he ran the inventory with the same systematic honesty he'd been applying all night to things that were harder. Seoa. Finished. In the sense of what they'd been to each other. Finished in the sense of the life they'd built in that coastal house. Finished in the way that the structures you construct always eventually are. Not always through catastrophe, but sometimes through the accumulation of the weight they carry. He felt the grief of it in the place where it lived, and he didn't push it away. It would take longer than one night to become something he could hold without effort. He knew that. The 3 men she'd killed. He'd make the calls in the morning. He knew who their families were. He'd known for 15 months. Had kept the file open, had never stopped looking at the case because the wrongness of it had always been there, a low signal he hadn't correctly identified. He would make those calls, and he would live with the specific failure of not having understood what he was looking at sooner, Ida. There would be a reckoning with Osaka, and it would be careful and patient and take longer than he wanted it to, and Seong-ho would run most of it, and when it was concluded, the regional network would have a different configuration than it currently did. That was future work. He filed it. Noah Bayek. He reached into his jacket and found the recorder, Amara's recorder, the cheap red plastic one she'd given him in the hallway yesterday morning, which he'd kept in his pocket through all of it, through the container yard and the Choryang-dong facility and the rain and the hospital, and which was still there, slightly damp but intact. He turned it over in his hands. The recording was still on it. He pressed play. Seoa's voice in the East Garden, thin through the cheap speaker. The other voice. The last thing I'll ever ask of you. And his wife's answer, I know. He listened to it once. Then he turned the recorder off. In the morning, he was going to need to have the conversation with Noah Bake that he'd promised. He was going to need to sit across from a man who had spent 20 years hating him with complete commitment and give him the unedited version of what had actually happened. And he was going to have to do it without managing the reaction, without constructing it for an outcome. Just the facts, in order, including the ones that reflected badly on Min-jae, and there were some of those. That was tomorrow's work. He was not going to rehearse it tonight. He put the recorder back in his pocket. 6 weeks later, on a cold afternoon with the light going thin and golden over the sea, Min-jae drove to the Bongseng Hospital where they'd taken June after the harbor and parked in the same lot and sat in the car for a while before going in. June had been shot at close range in the upper chest. The bullet had done damage that required 3 surgeries and 6 weeks of recovery, and would require more after that, the long, slow work of a body rebuilding what had been taken from it. He was alive because the shot had not gone where it was intended to go, because at the last second before Ida's man had fired, not Ida himself, the second man, the one who'd come from the right corridor the way Amara had described, June had moved. He had moved toward Min-jae. It had not been a decision in the conscious sense. Min-jae had reviewed it on the camera footage afterward, had watched it many times, and what it looked like was reflex. A body moving before the mind catches up. Something so deep in the architecture that it didn't require thought. He went inside and up to the room. Joan was sitting up, which was new. He'd been flat for most of the 6 weeks, the surgeries and the recovery requiring the specific submission of a body that has been significantly damaged and is being rebuilt. Sitting up was progress, and he looked like progress was costing him something, the pallor and the tight set of his mouth. He looked at Min-jae when he came in. The sardonic quality was starting to come back into his face, which meant he was feeling better. When June was seriously unwell, it disappeared entirely, and what was left was younger and more honest. "You're late," June said. "Traffic." Min-jae sat in the chair beside the bed. He'd been sitting in this chair a lot over the past 6 weeks, sometimes for hours, sometimes just for 20 minutes before a meeting he couldn't postpone. He'd brought things, books June hadn't asked for, food from a restaurant near the estate that June had mentioned once 6 months ago and Min-jae had remembered. He'd sat with him and not filled the silence with anything unnecessary, and June had let him sit there. That was something. The Osaka thing, June said. He'd been following the situation through Seong-ho, who'd taken to treating him as a person who needed to be kept informed, which was its own kind of decision. Concluded, Min-jae said. Ida retired. The network is being restructured. Retired, June said, with exactly the tone that word deserved. It was a negotiated arrangement. Min-jae paused. He's not going to be a problem. June looked at him with the look that meant he had more questions and was deciding which ones to ask. Noah, he said. He's in Gwangju. I set him up with work through one of the legitimate subsidiaries. Logistics, consulting, administrative, nothing that requires him to be near the operational side of anything. A pause. He knows it came from me. He didn't refuse it. Is that enough? No, Min-jae said. It's not enough. It's a start. June looked at the window. The sea was visible from this room on clear days, a strip of it between buildings, and today it was there, pale and cold in the afternoon light. He saved your life, June said, in the harbor, when Ida's man came from the right. You saved my life in the harbor, Min-jae said. Noah drew the second man's attention. He came out of the car when you told him to stay. June paused. He didn't have to do that. No, Min-jae said. He didn't. They sat with that for a moment. The organization, June said, changing. Slower than I'd like and faster than some people are comfortable with. Min-jae looked at his hands. The cut on his forearm had healed to a thin line. The meeting with the 4 syndicates happened last week. 3 of them are willing to adjust. 1 isn't. He paused. That one is going to be a longer conversation. And the legitimate side. Growing. He paused. Seong-ho thinks I'm making it up as I go. Are you? Mostly. A pause. But the direction is right. The direction I know. June was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the careful way he'd been saying things over the past 6 weeks, with the particular care of someone who has learned to mean what they say, when I'm out of here, the legitimate side, I want to work on that. Min-jae looked at him. I'm not saying the other side, June said. I can't. He looked at his hands. But the properties, the legitimate businesses. Seong-ho says there's a portfolio that needs management and nobody with the right structure for it. He looked up. I have business education. I have access. He stopped. I want to be useful. For something that doesn't... Okay, Min-jae said. June looked at him. Just okay. Yes. A pause. When you're cleared, not before. June looked at the window. Something in his face settled. Not dramatically, just a small realignment. The look of a thing that has been holding tension finally releasing a fraction of it. Amar's father is back at work, Min-jae said. I heard. She's been at the estate twice this week. She found a second nest in the south garden. He paused. She informed me that there are now 4 eggs between the 2 nests, and that the territorial behavior of the male is escalating because of the proximity, and that this is going to require monitoring. June's mouth did something at the corner. She told you that? In detail. And you're going to monitor it? Apparently. He looked at the window. She also informed me that my coffee is too dark and that I should be drinking green tea, and that my posture when I'm reading is going to cause problems in my lower back in approximately 15 years. June's mouth did the thing again, fully this time, the sardonic quality completing into something warmer. He looked at Min-jae with an expression that was layered in the way that expressions are when they contain more than one thing, and he said, She's good for you. She's 7 years old. I know what I said. Min-jae looked at him. Outside the window, the sea was pale and cold and constant, doing what it had always done. And in the hallway outside the room, a nurse was talking to someone about something ordinary. And somewhere in the city, Seong-ho was on the phone managing the long arithmetic of transition. And somewhere in Gwangju, Noah Bayek was sitting in a small office doing work that didn't require him to be what he'd been. And in the east garden of a coastal estate, a groundskeeper named David Johnson was repairing a fountain while his daughter cataloged the territorial disputes of a pair of brown-eared bulbuls with a red plastic recorder and the absolute focused attention of someone for whom the world is always worth watching carefully. Minjae sat in the chair beside his son's bed in the thin afternoon light and felt the specific weight of the moment. Not peace, exactly, because peace was not a state that men like him arrived at cleanly or quickly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a man who has looked at the full cost of his life and has not looked away from it and is still here, still breathing, still with things in front of him that require his presence. He reached into his pocket and set Amara's recorder on the bed beside June's hand. June looked at it. "What's this?" "Something I've been carrying," Minjae said. "I don't need to carry it anymore." June picked it up, turned it over, looked at the label on the back. A child's handwriting in marker, the name Amara in large, careful letters, and underneath it the single word important. He set it back down without playing it. "You should have destroyed that weeks ago," June said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" Minjae looked at the recorder, thought about the morning in the hallway, the feel of it in his hand, the quality of the silence before he'd pressed play, the 7 seconds he'd stood at the door, not knowing what was going to happen when the recording started. "I didn't know what it was going to cost," he said. "To know." June held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the recorder, and his hand closed around it, and he held it in his fist for a moment before he set it on the table beside the bed. "Take it home," he said. "Give it back to her. It's hers." Minjae picked it up, put it in his pocket. He sat with his son in the thin afternoon light until the light was gone and the room needed the lamp on. And then he stayed a while longer, and June slept eventually, the deep, unglamorous sleep of a body that is healing itself cell by cell, and Minjae sat in the chair by the window and watched the dark water beyond the strip of visible sea and breathed. He stayed until the nurse came by at 9 and told him visiting hours had ended. He drove home on the coast road with the recorder in his pocket and the sea to his left going black and silver under a clear sky. And he drove slowly, the way a man drives when he is not trying to get somewhere and is simply moving through the world. And the road curved and the lights of the city fell behind and the coastal dark came up around the car, and he drove through it. The estate was lit when he arrived. The East Garden lights were on, the automatic ones that came on at 8, and Minjae parked and sat in the car for a moment and looked at the lit garden through the windshield. There was a figure on the stone bench. He got out of the car, crossed the garden path. Amara Johnson was sitting on the bench with her field guide open in her lap and a small flashlight pointed at the page, which was a level of commitment to ornithological research that he was not entirely surprised by. She looked up when he arrived. "Your posture," she said, looking at how he was standing. "I know," he said. He sat down on the bench beside her. She angled the flashlight back toward the book. On the page was a detailed drawing of a brown-eared bulbul, annotated in the margins with notes in a child's handwriting that he couldn't read in the low light. "Your dad know you're out here?" he said. "He can see the garden from the kitchen," she said. "He waves sometimes." Minjae looked at the dark garden, the lit path, the shape of the old fountain that David Johnson had repaired last week, the water running again in its basin, the small sound of it steady in the night air. He reached into his pocket and took out the recorder, set it on the bench between them. She looked at it, then at him. "I thought you might need it back," he said. She picked it up and turned it over and looked at her own name on the back, Amara Important. And then she pressed the red button, and the recording started, thin and rough, Seoa's voice and the other voice, and she listened to 3 seconds of it and pressed stop. She looked at him. "This is the thing that started it," she said. "Yes." "Is it over now?" Minjae looked at the fountain. The water moved in its basin, small and constant, and the night was quiet around the estate, and somewhere above the garden a bird, territorial, committed, watching its particular piece of the world, was calling in the dark. "Yes," he said. She put the recorder in the pocket of her windbreaker. She turned back to the field guide. After a moment she said without looking up, "I knew you were scared that morning, in the hallway. I know you did. You said scared and careful weren't the same thing. They're not. She considered this. But you were both. Yes, he said. I was both. She turned a page in the field guide. He sat with her in the quiet garden and listened to the fountain and the bird in the dark. And the night settled around them the way nights settle when the thing that has been moving through them finally stills. And Kang Min-jae sat on a stone bench beside a 7-year-old girl who had noticed the wrong driver and breathed and did not look away from any of it. The most dangerous enemies were never the ones across the room. He'd known that in the abstract way you know things before they've cost you anything. He knew it differently now. And sometimes the person who saves your life does it not with a gun or a plan or 20 years of preparation, but with a red plastic recorder and the particular kind of attention that sees everything, judges nothing, and simply tells you what it finds. He stayed on the bench until David Johnson appeared at the garden gate and said gently, "Amara, time to go." She closed the field guide. She got up. She walked 3 steps toward her father and then turned and looked back at Min-jae on the bench. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Amara," he said. She went through the gate. He heard her father's voice, low and warm, and her answer, and their footsteps on the path. And then the quiet. He sat alone on the stone bench in the lit garden of his coastal estate and listened to the fountain and the sea below the cliffs and the bird in the dark that would not leave its territory. And he stayed there for a long time.